All right, so it is noon on my clock, so we will go ahead and get this virtual conference started. So thank you very much to everyone who is able to join today live. We had over 200 people register for this session, which is really awesome. And I know that not everyone can make it today, but thankfully we are recording and this will be available at a later date. So my name is Sarah Nizzi, and I am a Iowa Prairie Network regional board member for Region 2. So basically the north central kind of middle section of the state. And I will be your moderator today. So I will be introducing our speakers as well as facilitating the Q&A portions of their sessions. So a few things just before we really get things started. I'd just like to mention a little housekeeping, Zoom housekeeping, make sure that you are on mute. It's also really helpful to turn your video off to ensure that you have the best broadband and internet quality. That is really helpful. It doesn't bog down your line. And tech support, if anyone is having any issues, please feel free to reach out to Michelle Biodrowski, who will be kind of working behind the scenes here, Tim Youngquist, if he is still on currently, and Lance Brisbro. So they will be kind of doing all things behind the scenes that I might not be quick enough to catch, and I am not a tech savvy individual. Other announcements before we get started. The Iowa Prairie Network annual membership meeting is going to be held August 21st, so just in a couple weeks. It'll start at 10 a.m. at Doolittle Prairie, and we will have our business meeting starting at 12 p.m. at Alluvial Brewing in Ames. So that will all take place in Story County, and anyone who is an Iowa Prairie Network board member is welcome to join any of those festivities. And I should also mention that this conference is brought to you by the Iowa Prairie Network as well as the Iowa Prairie Conference Planning Committee. And there were a lot of individuals that were extremely instrumental in making this day possible. And Lael Neal is actually the chair, but she was not around for conversations on dates, unfortunately. So she has been out writing Ragbri all week. So she's not able to join us today. She hopefully will be out on a prairie at one of our field trips tomorrow. But she has done a lot of legwork, and although she is not with us, she is here in spirit, and we are really thankful for her stepping up and helping make this possible. Okay. So I think that wraps up a lot of those things. And, I'm just also going to mention that the theme for this year is prairie kinship. And quite frankly, that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. That could be, kind of whatever your relationship is with prairie in terms of whether you like to get out in prairie, whether you like to paint prairie, take pictures of prairie, grew up with prairie, are new to prairie, old to prairie, what have you, thinking about the relationships between plants and animals within the prairie, or thinking about it as a long-term ecosystem that has been here well before our time. And unfortunately, Iowa is the most altered state. And so the little prairie that we have left is not much to speak of. So a main mission of the Iowa Prairie Network is to really advocate for the remnant prairies that we have within our state. And prairie was introduced into my life early as a child, but I really never understood the concept of prairie until I was in college and working at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. That completely opened my eyes to the tallgrass prairie and this natural ecosystem that took up about 80 to 85% of our state at one point in time. And although I was born in Iowa and have lived here my whole life and have always thought of the tallgrass prairie as being kind of part of who I am and what I do, and that my career has really been prairie driven. It's really within my understanding the last year or so that it feels like it's a heritage, but it's not really my heritage. My people were not here first. My people were not born here. My roots are not tied to this land or this ecosystem like others. So it was important to me and others to really bring in somebody who has the voice and experience, background, roots, etc., that can speak on that. So I am super excited to introduce Sikowis, also known as Christine Nobiss, who is not originally from Iowa, but has been living here for quite some time and has been doing some really amazing work with all of her organizations and all the advocacy that she is involved in. So we are beyond lucky to have her here. So with that, I will just give a brief introduction. So Sikowis is a Plains Cree Saulteaux of the George Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan and grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She is a mother of 3 and the founder of Great Plains Action Society and Little Creek Camp, and has titled herself a Decolonizer. She has a MA in Native American Religious Studies and a graduate minor in Native American Indian Studies from the University of Iowa. Sikowis believes that Indigenous sovereignty and knowledge are ways to decolonize both people and the colonial capitalist economy. She has spearheaded many actions, events, and campaigns such as a resistant camp to the Dakota Access Pipeline, also known as Little Creek Camp, Indigenous at Skopak, the first Iowa-based Indigenous Political Engagement Summit, the removal of white supremacist monuments in Iowa, and the concept of truths giving. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Sikowis.
Tante, Ponepitigisgao, Mio Ponepitigisgao. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sikowis, and I am honored to be here today. And I was asked to try and be in a prairie setting. And I've been trying to grow prairie in my yard for some time, and this is my success, my little spot here that I've been able to get very hardy. And today I'm here to talk about Iowa from an Indigenous perspective and prairie and why it's so important, and what's happening here in terms of the climate and the environment because of colonial farming practices. Basically, the whole gist of everything I'm going to talk about today comes down to the process of rematriation of land and buffalo and Indigenous stewardship of that land. And that's because, well, that's the right thing to do, firstly, but also very importantly, we must understand that like carbon sequestration, why am I having trouble with that word all of a sudden, is one of the most important things we can do at this point in time, as our earth is literally dying, is actually, been proven to be at a point where it's very ill, and where we need to take action, and more than just talking and more than just producing more plastics to solve the problem. We actually need to go back to how we used to live, and use those ways to move forward, because these are very effective ways. One pristine acre of prairie can store up to 5 tons of carbon, and so we're going to get into that. So basically, no other landscape in the country has been biologically altered or biologically colonized, actually, to the extent that Iowa has. Iowa is big ag sacrifice zone. Big ag, also known as agribusiness or corporate agriculture, is the business where you commodify food systems for profit. And we all know here, probably in this conference, that's probably not a good idea to commodify food, because when you commodify food to that extent, you end up with what we've ended up with now, which is highly processed foods and food being grown as quickly as possible, without any thought being put into the detrimental effects that can happen because of it. According to the Iowa Prairie Network, Iowa used to be as biologically diverse as many rainforests in South America, but now its diversity is comparable to that of a desert, because all of the life has been taken out of here. It's almost like Iowa is an artificial environment where food is grown in soil that needs constant application of fertilizer, other nutrients, and whatever it needs to grow, due to monocropping and heavy rotation schedules. Like we are the number one contributor. This state is the number one contributor to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a toxic 6,000 to 7,000 square mile area at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Mass removal of trees and prairie have made way for these monocrop shallow root plants, CAFOs, concentrated animal feed operations, grazing pastures. Toxic runoff and topsoil are flowing heavily into our waterways, which are making their way, eventually to the Mississippi, and causing this dead zone, which is very disconcerting. It's fine. However, there's also another aspect of what's happening here in Iowa, which is urban sprawl and private land development, which also plays a significant role. Like Iowa, for instance, has the highest rate or highest number of golf courses per capita in the country, or per state in the country. And there's significant road and infrastructure development, and then also suburbs. And then there's lawns. So lawns make up like 44% of like the U.S. landscape, and they are created out of invasive grass species that are responsible for extreme water waste, excessive pesticide and herbicide use. And lawn care is a colonial enforced construct from Europe. It was something that was used by the elite, to show their wealth. And it's really about the control of indigenous landscapes here in the U.S. and Canada. And they are practices that are quite synonymous with the massive commercial farming industry. To date, the state has lost an incredible amount of topsoil from excessive runoff. The Environmental Working Group has reported that Iowa annually loses twice the amount of topsoil than the federal government estimates. Contained again in this runoff is animal waste, herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, commercial byproducts, and so much more, which are being ingested by us. Even though we try to clean our water as much as we can, eventually some of it gets through. We all know probably here in this in this conference, because there's a bunch of like-minded people here, about the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit. And we have a lot. And all the beaches that close, 70% of the beaches close, pretty much every year the past 3 years in Iowa, because of increased bacterial levels and whatever else is in the water that's causing really bad infections and serious sickness in individuals. And so according to Mark Edwards, who I hope is on here right now, who was a retired DNR Trails coordinator, an environmental activist, and one of my beloved elders and mentor, he has said, today Iowa competes for the very bottom in state parks and public lands. We are known as the most biologically altered state in North America. Roughly 98% of Iowa has been altered for agricultural use, cities and roads. And we now have covered 23.6 million acres, about 2/3 of the state in just 2 species, corn and soybeans. Excuse me, can you turn that down? So historically, also, I want to get into the indigenous aspect of this. Iowa is a beautifully pristine environment where there was actual corn farming going on, all sorts of farming going on here by the Iowa and the people that came in before that, and all these other nations that kind of came through, as they, as time has gone on. And this land was known for its fertility. And Iowa's the only state in the country that is bordered by the Mississippi River and the Missouri River. the two largest, most beautiful rivers in this country. And so, imagine why then we have such beautiful, or we did have such beautiful land here to farm. And settler invaders saw this as an opportunity so that they could implement their own colonial farming practices. And so Iowa was heavily genocided and heavily and native people were heavily removed from here, to the point that now we have one indigenous nation left in the state of Iowa, which are the Meskwaki. And the Meskwaki aren't even from Iowa. They moved in here about 200 years ago. And so the original inhabitants of Iowa aren't here. They're the Iowa, the Dakota, and the Kickapoo and folks, and all these other people that are no longer here. And so we need to be very cognizant and aware of that, because the removal of the prairie to bring in monocropping and colonial farming practices is also not synonymous with the removal of indigenous peoples. And the buffalo, who, as we all know too, was almost brought to extinction just for the sake of killing them, because settler invaders didn't like the buffalo because they wanted more pasture for their cows, and they wanted to get rid of native food sources. And so the removal of the prairie is also the removal of the native people and the buffalo and all the other animals and bugs and birds that flourish here. And there is a system here that is really important to remember, that prairie is not an end stage environment. Prairie is something that's always trying to get to something else, to woodland. And so if you want to keep prairie, which is essentially what was happening here, there was a system of the buffalo continuously trampling on it, eating on it, laying on it, and creating very hardy plants with the roots that are sometimes 8 foot deep. And indigenous people that also moved with those buffalo and actually took care of the prairie. They had controlled burns, and they moved the buffalo to where they wanted them to be, and so there was a relationship. And when you remove, one of those, and well, in this case, all 3 of them, you end up with a disaster. And that's what we're living in right now. We're living in a disaster zone. This is this is an end stage, and not the kind of, not what I was saying earlier about end stage being trying to get to a different type of environment. We're at the end of where we can possibly go with this environment, unless we take drastic measures to regenerate prairie. We need a regenerative economy here in Iowa, not just a sustainable economy, because we can't sustain this. This is not sustainable. We need regeneration. So where there used to be tall grass prairie, beautiful, oak savanna and wetlands, and woodlands, there are now rows and rows of genetically modified corn and soy interspersed with CAFOs, ethanol processing plants, suburban lawn landscapes, infrastructure, urban centers, and all of that. And so, big ag really has its root in colonial capitalist thinking. I mean, it really is a result of colonial capitalism, is what I'm trying to say, which is a result of Christianity and the belief that God gave man dominion over the earth. This dogma influenced the doctrine of discovery, which is a concept that gave Christian invaders, their right to lay claim to land that they discovered, right? Which is which is, we all know, not what actually happened. This land was never discovered because there was millions and millions of indigenous people living here already. And here in America, the doctrine of discovery was later expressed as manifest destiny, which is another term in case you're not familiar with the doctrine of discovery, which is an extension of this ideology that drove 19th century U.S. territorial land theft, and it gave justification for the annihilation of our people, and to civilize our people, and force them into boarding schools. And I'm sure if any of you follow not mainstream news, you know that right now thousands and thousands, the number is countless, of children were murdered at these schools. And this is for the sake, again, for the implementation of colonial farming practices, the want to build civilization, to build cities, whatever it is that the colonial endeavor was. This country was essentially founded, at the point of a gun for the sake of free labor and free land, and that's where we're at. Like that's the truth about what's happening, or what happened, and what is still happening in Iowa. And agriculture, in terms of Indigenous people, is a complicated thing, because what's actually not complicated. It was weaponized and used against Indigenous people. It was used as a way to civilize us, and then also used against us later when we proved to be quite good at it. I'd like to read you a quote by Sarah Carter in her book called Lost Harvest. She's speaking about policy in Canada, but this also applies to like what happened here too. And she says, agriculture was seen as the solution to the at best peculiar and at worst deplorable characteristics and idiosyncrasies which the Indians tenaciously and perversely cherished. The Indian had to be taught to make his living from the soil. No other occupation could be so assuredly dispossess. And my computer's doing something funny. I apologize. No other occupation could so assuredly dispossess the Indian of his nomadic habits and the uncertainties of the chase, and fix upon him the values of a permanent abode and the security of a margin of surplus. Agriculture would teach an appreciation of private property and impart a whole will to own and master nature. Farming a piece of land would promote an independent spirit and foster competition. I apologize, my computer is doing something very strange. And foster farming would promote an independent spirit and foster competition, qualities which would erode the tribal unit. Agriculture would nurture habits of industry and diligence. And so, I mean, just think about that. All the things that made the land safe here, all the things that made the land healthy, that protected the land, that protected the people, a sense of community, a sense of love for the earth, and a willingness to adapt to like the natural surroundings that you live in, were all basically taken away from Indigenous peoples, and they were given, like a till, and they were, forced into, an agrarian lifestyle. And then when they proved to be very good at that, all these taxes and all of these how would you say, roadblocks, I guess, were put in front of them, red tape, so that they would have a harder time farming, as settler invaders didn't like that they were particularly good at this. And so then a lot of Indigenous farmers failed, and then went into poverty. So, the thing is it wasn't like Indigenous people just said, hey, okay, well, I'm going to farm. I mean, we obviously put up a resistance to this. And I'd like to quote Smahala, a Nimipu warrior who founded the Dreamer religion. And this is out in the Northwest, particularly in Oregon. And he was against this. He was like, why do you want us to do these things? Because they are dangerous, and they are going to hurt, our mother, essentially. And Smahala said, in I think it's like the mid 1800s, you asked me to plow the ground. Shall I take a knife and tear my mother's breast? Then when I die, she will take me to her bosom to rest. You asked me to dig for stone. Shall I dig under her skin for her bones? Then when I die, I cannot enter her body to be born again. You ask me to cut grass and make hay and sell it and be rich like white men. But how dare I cut off my mother's hair? And you know, this actually speaks to the right to the heart of the issue. You know, think about tilling. What has tilling done for, you know, us? It's not good. What it does is it allows water to run straight through, you know, the soil, and it's also a lot of nutrients are lost this way as well. And now we have no-till farming, right? Organic farmers are implementing no-till farming. They're leaving the weeds in place as well. You know, they're like, well, the weeds are okay. You know, they foster competition. You know, and of course you can weed, but you know, by hand is fine. But with, you know, pesticides, and herbicides, no. You know, that's not something we should be doing. And so, you know, not only was Mahala speaking about the damage that would occur through the use of the plow and monocropping, he was verbalizing the damage that would take place through aggressive and exploitive extraction. And he was talking about, you know, like mining. He was talking about fossil fuel extraction. All of the things that we're doing that are tearing into our Mother Earth, you know, for the sake of profit. And that profit's not even used properly. I mean, the profit that is coming out of big ag, yeah, sure, it's going towards these corporations or industries that are, you know, probably supposed to support livelihoods and jobs. If you think about, you know, trickle down economics, but trickle down economics has proven to be a really, you know, false system that isn't really working for us. And also the crops that are being produced here in Iowa, the majority of them are corn and soy. And so much of that corn goes towards ethanol production. So much of that corn goes towards feeding, you know, animals. And so it's not even being ingested. It's being used for other industries that, frankly, we don't even need to be uplifting for reasons that I'll get into soon. So, you know, 97% of soybeans and 95% of corn grown in Iowa are also from biotech seeds, which also affects the environment because some of these seeds are not able to, you know, reproduce. And then, yeah, that's a whole other thing I don't think I should get into right now. But I know that people here are probably going to talk about GMO, you know, seeds and plants, and all of those GMO industries that are invading Iowa. So let's see here. Yes. So not only is the land and water being affected by big ag's runoff, but CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feed operations, are also highly responsible for increased runoff and air pollution. You know, according to the EPA, animal waste contributes 50 to 85% of U.S. ammonia emissions. Iowa is a prime example of direct source emissions, as it is host to 40 million hogs. The numbers will tell you 23 million, through some, you know, sites, some, you know, state site. But I've been told that the number can be as close to 40 million because people are not counting babies and pregnant mothers. So the state is a prime source of direct emissions because it's host to 40 million hogs, 4 million cattle, and 75 million chickens. And nearly half its corn production is used as the main energy ingredient in livestock feed, while the other half of all corn produced ends up as ethanol, which I've already stated. And I like this quote by Jonathan Foley, who writes in Scientific American. In short, the corn crop is highly productive, but the corn system is aligned to feed cars and animals instead of feeding people. And that's essentially what is happening here in Iowa. So, and I just started touching on CAFOs, and I really need to speak about that because that is a huge issue in the state. I want to give a shout out to Iowa. Excuse me, I don't know if I have the acronym right. It's IRA, Iowa Association for Responsible Agriculture, who has been working on, a factory farm moratorium, and also to lift the ag gag here in the state. And they are the people that I've gotten a lot of this information from, so thank you. Like right now in the state, there are over 15,000 concentrated animal feed operations, and the governor, our current governor, actually thinks that we could easily host another 30,000. So she thinks we could host 45,700 CAFOs in the state because there's so much need for fertilizer, manure. And in actuality, a lot of this manure is sitting there stagnant, leaching into our waterways. It's filled with heavy metals, antibiotics, and all sorts of other things, E. coli, that is, that could kill people, and is eventually, again, going down to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And so the reality of the situation is quite disturbing, to know that colonizers created a landscape so overfarmed and starving for nutrients that there is an actual need to pour antibiotic and heavy metal laden pig waste on the land is a very sad perspective for me anyway, from an Indigenous perspective, when you could be implementing traditional farming practices that they might not be as profitable, but then again, what is profit? And so that's a question that people constantly need to be asking themselves. Is profit about making sure that people are healthy and happy and fed, or is profit really about piling a bunch of money in front of like a few people? I have an issue. Indigenous people have an issue with hogs or pigs or swine, whatever you want to call them, as well, because they're not actually from here. Pigs were bought over by conquistadors, a few hundred years ago, and they quickly, spread disease, to the point that when the French came after, they have recorded like their visceral reaction to the genocidal aftermath, basically like they just like killed like whole villages of people, like nations, tribes, from interaction with these animals that brought like a lot of disease with them. And then additionally, the damage was not limited to just Mexico. It's in both the American continents. We have hogs all over, the U.S. and Canada, all the way down, to Peru, and they not only affected us initially with disease, but then over time tribes were forced in to swine herding, and to eating these meats because they didn't really have another choice, and so the animals are still affecting our health because we live in a lot of food deserts, Indigenous peoples. We don't have access to, high quality meat, for instance. Well, we do when we go hunting. But I mean, if you want to buy it from the store, you probably are going to buy a lot of pork, especially here if you're in Iowa, because it's so cheap. And that's really what it comes down to, price and availability. And so like Indigenous peoples right now have the highest rates of diabetes and obesity rates in the country. And they've been forced into a high meat, high sugar, high fat and processed food diet, due to lack of access to healthier foods. And the same thing is happening as well in inner city neighborhoods. And these are often BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so, pork is really not the answer. Ingesting large amounts of meat in general is not good for us. And so that comes down to this question, and I'm asking again, or not question, but point I'm making. We are so bad at like allocating land use here. Like the land is being used in the most inefficient way you can possibly imagine. And we have become a sacrifice zone for big ag and for the government here that aligns with, corporate conglomerates. Basically, this government is run by the economy. Therefore, corporate conglomerates are really the government. And really, I say the economy is king. And that's what we are subject to. And people, if they really want to change that mentality, they have to go way back to the beginning and understand why people think that they can have supremacy over the land in the first place. So white supremacy just isn't about the supremacy of a race of people, of white folks, Europeans, however you want to frame it. It's also about supremacy over the land. And that is such a hard concept for most people to deal with, because they can easily say, well, I don't want to be a white supremacist. I don't want to be racist. So blah, blah, blah. But you say, don't be a land supremacist, which also is also part of being white supremacist. And they can't understand that. And like colonial capitalism is so ingrained in people's way of thinking, even my own. I mean, like, indigenous people, like I might be indigenous, but it doesn't mean I wasn't brought up in a colonized environment, right? So like we all need to be thinking about like how we interact with the land, what we're doing, the products we're buying, and making them available to people who can't afford, in my opinion, these bougie products, right? These bougie products, they're important. We need them. We need organic food. We need organic farming. We need to reestablish buffalo, which of course costs more than cow. But it's about, what is our priorities and like what price mark do we put on these things? Because it doesn't have to be necessarily more expensive. It's just, or it can be more expensive, but people might get paid more and be able to afford it. So there's a whole system here that we have to like overturn and change, and it has to be done very quickly. The urgency it terrifies me, in which we have to do this. And there's so much more I want to talk about, but I'm going to get into the work that we're doing, Great Plains Action Society. And I'll be honest, we've done a lot of writing, a lot of speaking, but yet we have yet to have support so that we can, do the on the ground work in this vicinity, in this realm of organizing that we want to be in, because we're just a small organization, and there's really no, besides the Meskwaki folks who are doing wonderful work, by the way. There are no other opportunities for Indigenous people in the state of Iowa to really get involved with what's going on. Think about the Neil Smith Animal Refuge, or where the bison are being rematriated, the prairie is being rematriated. What's missing in that equation? There's prairie, there's bison, but where are the Native people? There might be some Native people that were consulted on the project, but in the end, like we actually need stewards who have jobs and are consistently in these spaces that like come from like lineages of people that like understand how the buffalo like moved and how they did things, because there is something that I wholeheartedly believe in. Yes, I believe in historical trauma, but I also believe in historical how would you say it? Historical intuition, historical knowledge. There's something deep rooted, and many of us, and also just because of our connections to our ancestors and our elders who teach us things, that we should definitely be a part of the rematriation of prairie in Iowa. So if we were to replant, for instance, I don't know, like 20 million acres of prairie, we could harness like the whole legacy carbon load of carbon in the US. I think that's the statistic. I'll have to look that up. But like I said, 1 pristine acre of prairie can can harness, 5 tons of carbon. So, just imagine that. Just imagine doing that in your backyard, for instance, or something like that. So, there are 26 tribes, that still have connections to Iowa, and I would like to see them have more of a connection here, and have an ability to be part of full swaths of rematriation of land here, so that we can, build back the prairie. So we need to change the laws. We need to remove, the ag gag, like I told you already what I was doing, and we need to, get the factory farm moratorium in place, because who needs 30,000 more CAFOs here? People like really need in Iowa to understand like how poisoned the landscape is. So we need to do a lot more work on educating people outside of our own spaces, outside of preaching to the choir. We need to somehow, help others understand the danger that they and their children, are currently in. We need inner city community gardens. The highest Indigenous population in the state of Iowa is located in Sioux City. And that's where we do a lot of work. My wonderful, excuse me. Somebody's trying to call me. My wonderful colleague and dear friend Trisha Ottringer, who is Ho-Chunk, is in Sioux City doing absolutely amazing work. And one of her dreams is to see an urban garden there, so that we can have Indigenous peoples, have a space to garden their traditional foods in a place where they should be. That's where 70% of our Indigenous population is in Iowa. So we really need to work on that, because the poverty rate for Indigenous peoples in Sioux City is astounding. They make up about 2% of the population, which is actually quite high for Iowa. Indigenous peoples, Native American people, make up as much as 45 to 63% of the houseless population. So just like think about that statistic for a minute, how disturbing that is, right? And so we need programs like this to bring back culture, to bring back first foods, food sovereignty, and healthy diets, and like community practices, because we have so many ceremonies surrounding food. And like right now, when I talk about it, I get goosebumps, because I get so excited thinking that like in our urban centers, we could really revive a lot of really important practices, and particularly at War Eagle Park. I won't go too much in depth with that, but that's a place in Sioux City that's very important to Indigenous peoples, and is actually a graveyard, but is a park, and Indigenous people are trying to take it back. And we actually did some ceremony there a couple of weeks ago, when the children were being rematriated back from Carlisle Indian School to Sikangu Oyate, the Rosebud Nation. There was 9 children that were, their bodies are being brought back home. And we just went to the park and we set up a teepee and we fed, the people, and the food was a big part of it, and so imagine if we were growing that food ourselves and how much pride people would have in it, and how wonderful it would be to learn from people that have essentially been shut out from their own land, and their own practices for so long, and that could teach Iowans how to overcome their colonial capitalist methods, their colonial capitalist farming practices, and we'd all be better for it. We also need to address worker mistreatment within the big ag industry here in Iowa. Big ag, rallying against big ag means calling out the mistreatment of workers, many of whom are Latinx, or Latina, but that means Indigenous as well. So, the Latino population is highly Indigenous here in the US. It's not well known. And so, for example, like, through our urban native COVID response in Sioux City, we addressed this issue because the Latina population, which is a high migrant population, has a high migrant population. They were the ones that were stuck in these meatpacking plants, almost like in an indentured servitude kind of way, having to work through the pandemic. Because of Donald Trump's Defense Production Act, and Kim Reynolds's and all these Pete Ricketts and all these other states and that were insisting that we keep up the production of meat because meat is so important, like without understanding that we could actually reduce the amount of meat we eat because America eats a disgusting amount of meat, a very, very unhealthy amount of meat. But no, it was very important that we make sure that we keep steaks on the table, and pork chops going. And so, with the COVID outbreak, this particular group of people was put through a lot, very high rates of COVID, high death rates of COVID. And Kim Reynolds never even mandated meatpacking plants report COVID-19 cases unless over 10% of the employees tested positive, because it exposes the high rates in these spaces. So like imagine some of these meatpacking plants that have thousands of employees, and they would have to have at least 10% of the employees test positive to consider it an outbreak. And like that's really disturbing because we had huge outbreaks in meatpacking areas like Waterloo, even here east of Iowa City, and then all over in Woodbury County, and all over Sioux City. So it's a very disturbing issue. It's an issue of white supremacy. They want people here to work for cheap, but they don't want to provide them with the resources they need to stay safe and healthy, and even to the point where they don't want to provide them with vaccines. So that's something we absolutely have to think about. And I encourage you to hit up LULAC and support their work in that case, because they are doing wonderful things to overcome that issue. And in fact, I was in a meeting with LULAC folks across the state just a couple of days ago, where they are right now uplifting their environmental work in conjunction with their social justice work, because they also see that the exploitation of the land goes hand in hand with exploitation of the people. And I want to say that again very clearly because Indigenous peoples, BIPOC people, they often live at the front line of all these disasters that we're facing. LULAC, LULAC. And that's to answer a question on there. And that's because, our reservations, our spaces, our territories are the first to be, extracted from because we're not considered wholly human by the settler invaders. Even now to this day, with the highest rates of missing and murdered people in the country, the highest rates of suicide, the highest rates of police murder rates, people are still coming into our spaces and extracting from them. And of course, Standing Rock and Line 3 are good examples of that. But also, like, big ag is something that Indigenous people have not really stood up to, like, in this capacity yet. And I want that to happen. I want to make this an issue within Indian country because the checkerboarding of our reservations to make way for private landowners to come in and rent or lease or buy land up within our reservations then creates poisons to be spread into our communities. And I know Iowa is a different kind of situation. It doesn't mean though that Indigenous peoples shouldn't be standing up here for the land and doing what we need to do to protect what is ours traditionally. And what our ancestors took care of. So, in the end, I just want to say that, prairie reclamation is key in Iowa, and it will be, it is an economically viable situation, and it's going to, save us from in disaster. We don't have much soil left here, so we have to move fast. And I think I'm done. Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. Just keep that term in mind as we fight, in the next few years to combat drought and heavy weather events based upon climate change, and so much more. So I thank you. Hi, Kitatumahen. I appreciate you being with me today. I don't know if there's time for questions. I think there is, but yeah, I'm happy to take some.
Yes, we do have time for questions. There was one early on. There's a gal who is curious about your earrings.
About your earrings.
Pardon me?
Somebody asked about your earrings, what they were.
Oh, these are made by native anthro, and these are dragonflies. And it's funny because as I was doing this talk, there was this huge dragonfly circling around here. So yeah, they're laser etched wood.
So Michelle wants to know, how do you keep your energy up? So I'm not sure.
Oh, like
exactly
my own personal energy?
Yeah, or maybe just how, what keeps you going and fighting personally. Yes. And she also notes mental, emotional, etc.
It gets hard because we deal with a lot of serious issues. And it's funny because I just answered this question in a talk the other day with an LGBTQIA group. I get really sad sometimes, particularly lately, because of the discovery. Well, not discovery. We've always known they're there, but the work to uncover and release the information about all of the unmarked mass graves of children that were killed at boarding schools, residential schools. And I'm using this as my example because it's a very real example. So I've been grieving very heavily. Really grieving, like wailing grieving, because they've only searched 8 schools so far, and there's 491 in the whole U.S. and Canada to search, and they've already found 1,500 children. 751 of those were found 2 hours from my reservation at the Cowessis Reservation, Cowessis First Nation. My First Nation is George Gordon, so that was 2 hours from me. And these people at this nation are Saulteaux. I'm Saulteaux. So I've been really very upset. But what keeps me going is ceremony, and then like faith in what my ancestors tell me and the path that they put me on, and then my children. I find that being in community, like going to be around my people, like in Sioux City, we just did a youth camp called Protect the Sacred, and just being around all these children and seeing babies and like toddlers, like it always uplifts me, because I don't know how anybody can feel sad when you see a child smile. And so I think what I'm trying to say is like community and ceremony and faith in my ancestors, and those are the things that keep me going.
Yes, thank you. And you've gotten some good love in the chat. And Deanna says, my heart aches for all the damage we are doing to the land and others. There are no other questions currently, but if you have them, feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, we have Lisa. Thanks for the important work you're doing in Iowa. Could you inform us of some of the initiatives GPAS is working on and how we can help uplift and support that work?
So GPAS, Great Plains Action Society, we are working on a few different initiatives. Of course, this Big Ag initiative has been close to my heart for many years, about 10 years now. And I've only really done work on it for about 5. And like I said, even then, like, I would like you to print the zine and disseminate it if you can. All this information that I gave you comes out of a piece of writing that I made that is on our website at greatplainsaction.org. And you can also go to our zine link and you can print the zine and you can disseminate it. And we also are working on a missing and murdered Indigenous relatives crisis. The area between Sioux Falls and Omaha is a really scary area for Indigenous peoples. Omaha is 10th in the nation for cities with the highest rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And like I told you, the houseless rate in Sioux City is ridiculous. And there's a lot of sex trafficking happening in this area. And it's just a place that Iowa needs to start paying attention to, because this is also a part of Iowa. And so we've been working with 4 families there that have been affected by the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives crisis. Lanice Blackbird's family, Cozy Decora's family, 2 women that were murdered in the area and who have not really received proper justice. The tribes, the state, the BIA, they're not doing as much as they should. And so our little organization fundraises to provide them with support. For instance, we just gave one of the families some funds yesterday so that they could travel to some court proceedings, because, you know, these are huge hardships when somebody dies. And so we basically, we do mutual aid for missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, families. And so we'd like to support in that way, monetary support, so that we can continue to provide the funds that they need for, again, lawyers' fees, travel fees, even childcare, because some of these people's children are now without a parent. And then more memorial expenses. We helped with a memorial very recently. And Trisha, again, my sister and my friend is doing so much of that work on the ground. And we'd love to be able to hire another person to help her out. So that's where we need help. We also have been working on the police brutality aspect of this work for 4 years now, since Zachary Bearhills was murdered in Omaha. And we've helped organize and host a prayer march and vigil every year now for 4 years in Omaha. And that, that's a lot of expense right there, because we like to support the family to come up from Oklahoma. We also work on mutual aid efforts in Des Moines. We work very closely with Des Moines Mutual Aid. One of their founders, Ronnie Free, is what it works with us like very closely. He's one of our collective members, and we help support with propane tank donations, whatever. And then there's our environmental work. We were integral in the Dakota Access Pipeline fight here in Iowa. Also the KXL fight in Nebraska, because we do a lot of work in Eastern Nebraska as well. And please take a look at our Mead work. Mead, Nebraska had an environmental catastrophe happen just like last year, and nobody knows about it. It is a toxic mess there right now, and people are in grave danger from an ethanol plant's misdeeds, if you will, because they use pesticide-laden grains to create ethanol, and then the whole thing happened. But go to our YouTube site. If you go to our website, you can click on our YouTube site and you can watch the video that we created out of it, and then also the forum that we had. And then also we're supporting folks up at Line 3, because Line 3 is actually going, the media for all this is, go to our website, greatplainsaction.org, and then click on our YouTube link, and you can see the Mead video there. And then also our Facebook page has a lot of stuff. And then we have our blog on the website, where you can read the articles and read the zine that I was talking about. And so what was I saying? Oh yeah, Line 3. So they're drilling under the headwaters of the Mississippi. I mean, like, what does that mean to people up there? It means a lot, but it also it's significant to people downstream, right? We all live downstream. You've heard that term before, I'm sure. And so what happens if there's a leak under the Mississippi headwaters? Like it comes all the way down, through Iowa, and then, again, down to the Gulf of Mexico. And so, we are supporting relatives up there. We have one of our collective members up there right now who we try to support as much as we can. And then there's, our political work. We do a lot of political engagement work because in the end, everything we do comes down to legislation. And so right now we're working on banning a critical race theory campaign. Our two youth are leading that. That's also on our website. And we are trying to uplift our food sovereignty work. We just don't have capacity yet. But one day I hope we do. Like I said, I would like to be able to get some urban gardens going in Sioux City. I would like to rematriate Prairie with Indigenous leadership and also our Buffalo brother and sister leadership in that. And those are some of the things we're working on. There's always more, but those are the main things.
Great, thank you. We have just a few, like 2 minutes left. So there's another question. How does rematriation work? That is, can individual settler landowners somehow give land to Indigenous peoples?
That would be great, but it's not just about giving the land away, because I've actually been offered land in Missouri before, 10 acres. And I'm like, what am I going to do with that? Right? Like, thank you. I appreciate it, but I don't have the capability to do what I want to do with it. So it takes not just people giving us the land, but working in conjunction with experts or people that are already rematriating Prairie that can help us, and also the funding, right? Because the land is great, but we need the funding to do what we need to do on it. So, that's something that I've been working on for years, and hopefully one day it actually comes through. It's a dream of mine. It would be like an ultimate goal for me, frankly. And rematriation means the same thing as repatriation, essentially. But I like to uplift the matriarchy, because colonial capitalists basically killed matriarchy, and I want to bring that back.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you again. So many thank yous. Danielle also has some comments and a question that perhaps you can address, or maybe add some resources into the chat.
Where is this? Sorry, the chat.
Yes.
Sorry, I can't find it. Oh, there it is.
Yep. Danielle Worth has commented a few times, but
oh, okay. Thank you, Danielle. Yes, change does not come from, yes, cognitive dissidence is an issue. Having difficult conversations is very important. So, yeah, thank you so much. Ahai kitata mehen.
That was a really wonderful and enlightening and important presentation to have. So I am just really thankful that she was able to join us today. So next up, we have Chris Helzer. He is the Nebraska Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy, also known as TNC. His job includes both prairie research and evaluation of grassland restoration and management approaches used on TNC properties. However, the majority of his time is spent on communication, sharing lessons learned from TNC land with other landowners, managers, and trying to build a larger continuancy for prairie and prairie conservation. Photography and writing are important components of his outreach work, along with field tours and presentations. He is the author of the Prairie Ecologist blog, as well as 2 books and numerous magazine articles. So with that, take the floor, Chris.
All right, thank you. I am not sure how to follow Sikowis's presentation, but I'm going to do my best. It'll be a tonal shift, so stick with me. So what I want to talk about today is this idea that we all do different things in conservation. We all have different roles that we play. But for all of us, what we're doing isn't going to matter unless the public is behind us. And what that means is that regardless of what your role is, whether you're in education or land management or grants administration or any part of conservation, we all have a responsibility and an opportunity to engage the public and help to make sure that they're behind us. And unfortunately, for people like me, at least, who are pretty introverted, it means talking about ourselves. And it means that we need to be out there in front of people in ways that can be sometimes a little uncomfortable. But it's important, and here's why. We need the public to be behind us because that's where funding comes from. We need the public because that's how policies are supported. Direct action on habitat, whether it's coming from farmers and ranchers or people who are volunteering, or a wide range of other people who are doing direct action to impact habitat, we need those people to be doing that work. And then also, just people's lifestyle choices, right? And there's a bunch of indirect stuff, and one very little or unimportant thing, but still important, is that we all work really hard, and it's nice to have people that actually appreciate what we're doing. So how do we do this? I think what I've seen, at least, is that banging people over the heads with facts is really important, but it's not the first step. So it can be something that turns people off. It can cause them to kind of shut down and stop listening if we go too heavy too quickly. And so I think at least for a lot of people, the place we should start is by sharing our passion, by explaining why we care, what it is we care about. And I want to give a couple of examples of that. I think monarch butterflies have been a really good example of that over the last several years. People don't care about monarch butterflies because they're pollinators. People care about monarch butterflies because they're pretty, they have a cool lifestyle, the whole migration is fascinating. There's something we see, we can have interactions with them, and we don't want to lose that. And the fact that they're pollinators is important there, but if we lose monarch butterflies, pollination is still going to happen. There's no plant species that I'm aware of that are going to, disappear off the earth if monarchs disappear. And yet people care about monarchs. So I think that's a good example of where sort of interest or passion or concern and really storytelling about monarchs is what makes people care about monarchs. And so I think we can apply that to other things, right? I mean, who could not fall in love with bobolinks, which are, birds with a punk hairstyle who sing like R2-D2 and put their eggs right on the ground. That's a species that people can get behind. We have to tell the right stories about that species. Or talking about yucca moths and that tight relationship between the yucca plant and the yucca moth, which is the only pollinator that we know of that can pollinate yucca effectively, because they have to carry pollen from the flower and then stick it in the ovary very purposefully in order for pollination to happen. And we can get goofy about it too, or semi-goofy. This is the Southern Plains bumblebee, one of my new favorite insects, which has a perfect haircut. And you look at some bumblebees that look like they just got up in the morning and rolled out of bed, or some that, need to go back to bed because they've had a really rough day. And the Southern Plains bumblebee just sort of buzzes through life looking perfect, like they get up and pluck their eyebrows every morning or something. Or, snakes are a tough sell sometimes, but if you can show snakes with personalities, maybe that are fun. This is not a venomous snake. Well, it's not a dangerous venomous snake. This is a hognose snake. I almost forgot the name of it. This is a hognose snake that, if it feels threatened initially, will pretend that it's really dangerous, flattens its head, it hisses, sounds like almost like a rattlesnake. It's a really impressive display. And it's watching you very closely to see if you're going to buy it or not, right? And if you don't buy it, then it flips and it switches strategies and it wriggles on the ground. It flips itself upside down. It lolls its head to the side and pretends like it's dying. And again, watches you very closely to see if you're buying it. And it's just the goofiest looking snake, but it's so charming. They're fascinating creatures and they can be good ambassadors. But again, it's the story that makes them interesting. They're not a particularly rare species, at least in Nebraska where I'm at. I wouldn't go out and, tell people they should care about them because they're disappearing. I tell them they should care about them because they're fascinating. So I already can hear people saying, okay, yeah, I know, we should do this. but I have a really busy job and I have a life outside of that job. And my job doesn't involve talking to the public, right? That's not one of my main job duties. And I get that. I really get that. This first part of my career, I was a land manager, and you just feel overwhelmed every day with invasive species and all the other things that have to happen. And that's true no matter what your job is in conservation. At the same time, who else is going to do it? Because I don't know about your organization, but the organization I work with and the organizations that we partner with don't have a lot of staff whose full-time job it is to go out and translate and work with the public and get them to care about conservation. There are people who are doing that, and that's amazing, and they're great, and we need more of them. But one way to get more of them is that all of us chip in a little bit, because there's way more work to do than can be done by the people who have that as their primary job description. So I'm going to try to hopefully give you some ideas about how you can help with this without making it seem overwhelming, provide some perspective that I think will be helpful. And I want to start with the idea of meeting people where they are, because I think this is really important. I think, if you look at people across the whole spectrum, urban, rural, everywhere, different cultural backgrounds, there's a wide range of how people look at nature. And while there are some people who are very active and passionate about nature, there's probably more people who are on the other end who are either not interested, don't pay attention, or afraid. And it's really important to recognize where that's at, because while we care about nature, that makes us sort of think that most other people might feel the way we do. And in reality, it's the opposite. We've got a lot of work to do. And I'm realizing that my computer is trying to move these along automatically. That's not helpful. But people who are afraid of nature, there's conversations we need to have there that are very different than the conversations we have with other people. Talking about the box elder bug that they've seen in their apartment that they think is going to hurt them is a really important issue for them. And if we don't deal with that, we're not going to be able to move much further. And then, people who just aren't paying attention, just sometimes pointing out the nature that's around them, nature that's accessible to them no matter where they live in positive ways can be helpful. Later on, when we've moved them up the spectrum, we can start thinking about, getting them out to a site, taking them out hiking, showing them things out in the places that we work a lot. And then, potentially getting them involved in projects and bringing them in even more passionately. And the end goal, of course, for a lot of us is to get people to the point where they can really support us on these really important issues when we need them to back us up. So again, the idea is let's move people from one end of the spectrum to the other. And the question is, how do we do that? But the most important, starting point of that is to meet people where they are. And especially for people who are on sort of the left end of that spectrum, the best way, or at least a really good way to engage people who are either indifferent or oblivious or afraid of nature is through storytelling. And not just storytelling about the species or about the nature that we care about, but storytelling that involves ourselves. So what are the things that we see? What do we care about? What do we do on our day-to-day basis? The things that we do that we think of as like boring, this is just the work that I do every day. For people who aren't in this field, it can be really fascinating. If you go out and fix fence all day on a ranch or on a nature preserve, the work itself is something that people would be interested in if you sell it right. More importantly, the fact that you're doing it for a particular reason, talking about the things that you see while you're out there, talking about the reasons that you're doing it and how you get through it and why you feel good about the work you're doing. All of those things are going to be really interesting to people, especially because the way we connect to each other as people is we connect to each other's stories. And if someone is interested in you and they're interested in your stories, they're going to be interested in what you care about. And this works whether you're talking to a couple people at a bowling alley or at a bar or through social media or really any other interactions that we have with people. Sharing your stories with your personality, your perspective involved is a really good first step at talking about nature and conservation. So here's an example of, I think, a less effective approach, which is immediately upon meeting someone, starting to, give them a bunch of facts about nature problems. I think what I'm advocating for here is this approach, right? Wow, we had a great fire today. We killed a bunch of cedar trees. Next year we ought to see a bunch of prairie chickens and butterflies. I'm really excited. Bringing it back to like this is how I feel about it. This is why I'm excited about it, and that's going to spawn questions like this one, right? Like, oh, I didn't realize cedar trees are a problem, and then that's the time you can hit them with facts, right? But sometimes you've got to hook people first before you hit them with facts. Otherwise, they're going to turn you off. And the same thing applies on social media, right? I'm not always perfect at this. I'm trying to get better. I'm trying to learn my own lessons here. But the posts that I do that get the most engagement are the ones where I'm talking about my own emotions, my own perspective, my own stories. And so rather than talking about, painted lady butterflies are really cool because they migrate to the desert Southwest, or they migrate out of the desert Southwest and back every year, which is a great story. Starting that story with, wow, I was really excited to see this cool butterfly today. I really hope that they have a successful migration this year. Then it brings it back to me as well as about the butterfly. Or talking about the work that you're doing again. Seed harvest is a great it's a great task that a lot of people can buy into. They can recognize the value of, but this really can work with all kinds of other things. But again, it's about how do you feel when you're doing that work? Why is that work important to you as a person? It's the story about you rather than a story about the work that's going to be as effective as anything. And I'm showing this picture because this picture with me and a bunch of flying ants around my head is the most liked picture I've ever put on Instagram, which I think is hilarious, but I think it's also instructive. And I put this up here to say that when I talk to people about doing outreach and conservation, I get the pushback of, okay, yeah, but you're a photographer and not everybody's a photographer. And if you don't have great photos, that makes it a lot harder. And there's some truth to that. But for the most part, it's not really the photo as much as it's the story. And if you're worried about the photos, the easiest photo in the world to take is a selfie. Everybody can take a selfie. You look at the camera, your phone, you push a button, and you've got a selfie. And that seems to be, whether I like it or not, a really good way to engage people. And if you look at the people who have the biggest followings within the conservation world, they are the ones that have videos of themselves. They have pictures of themselves. It's their face and their stories that they're telling with their face that are really engaging people, right? And so you don't have to be a photographer to take pictures that people are going to engage with. And again, it's the story as much as the photo that matters. So the other thing I want to make sure people think about is you don't have to be an expert, right? You don't have to be someone who knows everything about everything, because A, there isn't that person, and B, that's not what people care about the most. People are going to care about perspective. So if you see an insect like this that looks like a praying mantis, but also a wasp, but also kind of a fly, you don't have to know that that's a wasp mimic mantis fly. You just have to think it's really cool. And then you can talk about, wow, I saw this really cool thing today, and I either got a picture of it or here's a picture I found online that looks a lot like it. I was really excited. I wonder what it does. And that wondering is actually the part that people are going to connect with, right? Asking questions. You don't have to know the answers. You have to wonder about the questions. So ask questions and you'll get people to respond who either know the answer or who are on your side and they also want to know the answer or have similar questions. And all of a sudden you have an engagement. You have a following that of people who want to talk to you about this thing that you found. If you tell them the answer right at the beginning, this is what we're doing in science classrooms, right? If you're involved in education, the way science is being taught now is much more about trying to get kids to ask questions, not about telling them the answers, because it's getting them into that process. So that is really freeing if you're doing communications, because that means you don't have to know the answers to start with. So express yourselves, talk about what you care about, what you're wondering about, the questions that you have, your hopes for the future, and that's what people are engaged with. At some point, if we can get people far enough along that spectrum I talked about, one of the steps is to try to get them out to our sites, right? Get them out to a prairie and try to show them what it is we've been talking about for so long. And there, the same thing applies, right? In order to get people out there, it's really helpful to go out and talk about the prairies that you're looking at, what you're seeing there, species that they might recognize the name of, and then talk about the fact that they're there, talk about the change from day to day and season to season, all the things, and then give them something that they can look for when they go, right? Boy, the 4-point evening primrose is really gorgeous right now. You know, it'll be blooming for the next couple of weeks. If you want to go see it, now's the time. Or hey, it's a great time to see upland sandpipers, or painted lady butterflies are really abundant now, something like that that gets them excited. And then when they go, they'll have something to look for. It gives them a reason, and it gives them something that's accessible when they get there, because they'll recognize something if they see it. For most people, prairies, as you know, are a difficult sell, right? They're just these flat, boring areas full of grass. Why would I go out there? And the ideal situation is if we can take people by the hand, lead them out into the prairie, and start showing them things that we love about prairies. And sometimes we can do that. If we can get them to a field day, or if we can take people on tour, that's a fantastic way to do it. But it's really hard to do that every time. So the question then is, if people go out to a prairie without a guide, or without a personal guide, what can we do to help them make sure that they have a first experience that's positive, right? If your neighbor takes their kid out to the local prairie, if they get there and it's hot and they don't see anything that they know, and they get a mosquito bite, they're just going to turn around and go home, and they're probably never coming back. And so talking about what they might see, giving them things to look for, is really important. And this is different than a field guide, right? So you don't want to hand somebody a field guide and say, yeah, go explore that prairie, it'll be great. And we at the Nature Conservancy here in Nebraska have made a few small strides in this direction. We haven't gotten it right yet. If you want to see an early attempt at this, you can go to prairienebraska.org, and there's a tab at the top of the page that says Explorer's Guide to Prairies. And that gives you an idea of sort of one of our early steps toward this. But the idea here with the Explorer's Guide that we've created is to create something that actually helps people find something that they can recognize when they get to a prairie, tell them what to look for, give them a guide to how to be in a prairie, rather than a guide to what the prairie is about, or how to identify particular species. So, for example, we show them things like, if you see something that looks like a butterfly, here's how to tell whether it's a butterfly or a moth. Or if you see something that looks like a grasshopper, it might be a katydid. Here's how you tell the difference. Or, look for tracks in these kinds of places. If you see tracks, follow and we'll see where they go. Here's some ideas of what those tracks might be. But the most important thing is tell them what to look for and help them know how to explore a site, because we take that as something that we do every day. But most people don't. And then what I want to sort of do with the last part of this presentation is talk about the passion and the curiosity that all of us have to have in order to share it. And I think sometimes it's helpful to have someone remind you that it's okay to spend time, I would say on the job, but check with your supervisor, but hopefully your supervisor will be supportive of this. But definitely off the job, connecting with the sites, the nature of the prairies that we love in a way that we can do it through curiosity and exploration, rather than, just killing weeds or whatever it is that we do day to day. So I'm going to share a couple of things, some stories from myself, starting with some things that I've seen just in the last week or so, and then we'll kind of wrap it up and have some discussion if we want. So one of the things that I saw this last week is not a new thing to me, but I love seeing it every time, which is the cudweed grasshopper. And cudweed grasshopper feeds on cudweed sagewort, also known as white sage or white sagewort. And the camouflage on this thing is just fascinating every time. I'm always impressed. This is a photo I took last week up at our Niobrara Valley Preserve here in northern Nebraska. But this is a really cool thing to show people on field trips, and they're easy to find. If you see a patch of white sage, at least around here, if you kick around in it a little bit, every once in a while a little white grasshopper jumps out, you can catch it, hold it up for people to see, grab a little bit of the plant, hold them side by side, and it's a pretty cool, easy story to tell about a species that looks exactly like the food that it best likes to eat. I was hanging out in a blowout last week up in the sandhills and got to watch these little dung beetles, which I don't honestly see very often. So it was really cool to watch them. And I spent the time watching it roll around this little deer pellet. Pretty sure it was a deer pellet, and then start to bury it. And I didn't watch it for the entire process, but I did check back a little later. I kind of marked the spot and came back after I took some pictures of other things, and I found the hole where it had buried the dung and itself. And I'll admit that I was really curious. I wanted to make sure it was right. So I stuck my hand into the sand and I sort of pulled it up to make sure it was there. And it was, and I put it right back very gently. And I hope I did it in a way that didn't overly disturb it. But just a very cool story that I saw just because I was out wandering around paying attention to things. And then some of you probably saw me talk about this story, but I'll talk about it quickly anyway, because this is my favorite insect in the world, at least right now, which is the camouflage looper. It's the larva of the wavy-lined emerald moth. And I saw this also up at the Niobrara Valley Preserve. It was sitting on this sunflower, and I spent some time taking pictures of it because I love, every time I see it, trying to take as many pictures as I can. But then I also wanted to show some other people. So I took the plant and the caterpillar with me, and I took it back to the headquarters to show staff, and I ended up bringing it home to show my kids. And I put it in a vase, kind of a makeshift vase, and put some plants in there. And then I put a piece of paper towel across between the plants and the water because I didn't want the caterpillar to fall off and fall in the water. And I thought it would be really, I put a couple different kinds of plants because I thought it would be fun to see how it changes its costume, because the camouflage looper, the reason it's so cool is that as it's eating these flowers, it takes pieces of those flowers and it glues them to its back as a disguise, which is just fascinating and cool. And I've read about, people that keep them for a while and they watch them change their costume every time they change to a different plant. They match that plant. So I thought, well, this will be great. The kids and I can watch this happen. So I put it in there with the paper towel to protect it, and it decorated itself with the paper towel, which is amazing and perfect and unexpected, but great. Something else I saw recently that I hadn't seen before, or at least I hadn't photographed before, was this. And I wonder if anybody knows what this is, and don't say it out loud, but if you know what it is, raise your hand to yourself and feel good about it. I did not immediately recognize this, but I'll give you a clue to what it is, which is this. It's an adult spittlebug or frog hopper, depending on what you want to call it. And so the larvae of spittlebugs, you probably know, are feeding on plants, and they create these little bubbles out their back ends that basically my kids like to say that they're little fart bubbles that they can hide in, which is a pretty cool way to think about it. And it's a protective way. It's protective from predators. It keeps them from being desiccated. And this is what the adult looks like, which is pretty neat. Okay, those are a couple of recent things, and then just a couple other things. I don't know how many of you know the specifics of how milkweed gets pollinated, but to me, it's one of the most fascinating stories, and it's a great one to hook people with, I think. And so if you look at a milkweed flower, it's really different from a lot of the other flowers we have, right? And there's this little slit in there, and inside that slit are these gel packs of pollen called pollinia, and there are two of them. They're kind of like little saddlebags connected by a strap. And in order for pollination to happen, insects have to walk around on those plants and accidentally slip their feet into those slits. They don't do it on purpose, because sometimes they get in there and they can't get out. And you can find little insects sometimes that get stuck and die because they get trapped in those little slits. But if it works right, what happens is the foot goes in, the insect pulls the foot out, and as it pulls it out, it hooks the saddlebags, those little gel packs, those pollinia, on their feet, which is halfway done with the process, right? And it doesn't seem like it should happen often. But if you look at something like this wasp that just finished walking around on that swamp milkweed flower to the left of us, there's a lot of pollinia on its feet. Every one of those little yellow things there is one of those packets of pollen. And so they really do pull it out. But that's only, again, that's the first half of the process, right? The second half of the process is getting those pollinia back into a slit on a different flower. And so the same leg has to accidentally slip into a different slit on a different flower in order for pollination to happen. And that shouldn't work. That's a story that shouldn't work out well in the end for milkweed. And yet we see milkweed seeds every year. And so it absolutely does work. Here's a large milkweed bug with a couple of plenia being pointed out on it there. So it's not just wasps, it's lots of different things. And it's something that you can watch for. It's a story that every time I go out and look for insects on milkweed, I'm looking to see if they've got those little plenia stuck to their feet. And then this is a story I've been telling more and more lately because it seems to resonate with people. And that is the idea of perennial prairie plants and how long they can live and how they do it. Because people are fascinated with some of the trees that are, you know, trumpeted as being these long-lived trees that can live 1,000 years or something. And that is really cool. But we in the prairie should not bow to that. We have our own really cool stories that we can tell. It's really hard to know how old our prairie plants are because they're mostly herbaceous. But the way that they do this, and I just want to make sure everybody understands how this process works because it's really, really cool. So if you look at the plants on the left, those are some perennial sunflowers. And at the base of these perennial plants, and this is true for just about any perennial herbaceous plant out in the prairie, are these little buds. And the buds at the base of the plant can turn into the next generation of stems, above ground stems. They can turn into roots. They're basically the beginning of the next generation of that plant. So those buds can be deployed in the middle of the season, right? If the plant gets grazed off or burned off or stepped on or whatever, it might choose, rather than to continue trying to grow out of the stem that it had going, it can choose to switch and start growing out of a new one, and they'll deploy a bud and start growing from there. Or they'll wait until the next year, right? They go dormant over the winter time. The next year's growth comes from these little buds. And the buds are created annually, and they're created when the plants have enough energy to do it. And so really, as long as these plants have enough energy each year to create a new set of buds and to maintain that bud bank, the plant can really live technically or hypothetically forever, right? These are immortal plants, which is an amazing story to tell people. Now, it usually doesn't work out like that because they'll get eaten by something. So there's a lot of things that can happen. But a lot of these species are actually also clonal, which gives them an additional advantage, right? So if you look at the picture on the right, you see the rhizome between those two tillers. A lot of times the plants that we're looking at in clumps are these clones of, you know, one genetic individual with a lot of different stems, and that spreads that risk tremendously, right? So part of that might get eaten, part of it might get affected by a disease, but there's a really good chance that part of that clone is going to live for a very long time, which means that we probably do have plants like organisms like big blue stem clones or Missouri goldenrod clones that really honestly could be thousands and thousands of years old, which is a pretty amazing thing to think about. And I'm going to end with my square meter project, which some of you are probably familiar with. I apologize if it seems redundant, but I want to talk about it because it's a project that has taught me a lot and it's resonated with people more than I thought it would when I started. So if you're not familiar with what I did, I went out in January 2018, I put some flags in the ground. I marked out 1 square meter of prairie here in Aurora, Nebraska, where I live. And then I tried to go over the next year, I tried to visit that little square meter plot as often as I could and photograph everything I could. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of things that I photographed. I'm not going to show you that many because I don't have a lot of time left. But the idea was, for me initially, was here's a different way to talk to people about prairie diversity and kind of the dynamism of prairies. How do they change from day to day, season to season? This will be a new way to approach that topic for me. And I ended up being able to photograph 113 different species in that square meter plot over the year. That included 15 plants, 22 different kinds of flies, 18 different kinds of beetles, 14 different kinds of bees, and then 44 other species. And that was cool. 113 was a lot. I thought that was pretty good, especially because this is a small, isolated little fragment of restored prairie. So it's not a remnant prairie. It was something that was planted in the 1980s by Prairie Plains Resource Institute, Bill Whitney. And it's right here in town, so that limits how many things can be there. So 113, I felt pretty good about. But it wasn't the numbers that got people to pay attention to the project. It was the stories that I was telling along the way and then afterwards about the project itself. So for example, stiff sunflower was a species I was excited to have in the plot because I know that it attracts a lot of pollinators. But before I could start taking pictures of all the pollinators that came to it, they started to get attacked by things. So this one got knocked down by the silphium weevil, or the head cutting weevil. And what that weevil does is it girdles the stem below the flower, so the flower tips over and eventually falls off to the ground. And what they do then is they lay their eggs inside the flower. And when the flower drops, the larvae inside that have been feeding on the flower can drop down and just crawl right into the soil. It's like creating a kind of a transportation system as well as a food system for the larvae, which is pretty neat. But that means that in this square meter plot where I had a very small sample size, that was a flower that I didn't get to take pollinator photos on. And then the other thing that really hurt me on pollinator photos was this little leaf beetle that showed up and just decimated every single blossom in the area of prairie that I was in. So they crawled all over the place. They ate pretty much everything on the flower and left them all looking like this, just completely ravaged. And so I didn't get a single pollinator photo of anything on stiff sunflower, which was, disappointing in some ways, but also really fascinating. And it made a great story. And fortunately, Maximilian sunflower was also in the plot and sort of came in right as that leaf beetle was sort of going away for the year. And so I got lots and lots and lots of pollinator photos on Maximilian sunflower. Everything worked out great. It was another story I could tell. But then there were I'm going to give you a very small sample of some of the other stories that came out of the project. This is called a Durbid plant hopper. But what I thought when I saw it initially was that it was a dead thing. It was the exoskeleton of some insect that had molted out of it, because it looks to me, I don't know if it looks like it to you, it looked to me at the time, especially, like it's translucent and empty. And so I started taking pictures of it because I thought, well, this is a cool little exoskeleton. It's going to be easy to take pictures of because it's not going to move. And then it started to walk, which really freaked me out. And I saw it again a couple of weeks later, got some more pictures of it. But man, look at the blue, look at the red colors on this thing. The wings are like 3 times the size of the body. It's a cool little thing that sucks juices out of plants. And it's a species I never knew about before, probably wouldn't have seen it, except that I sat and stared into this tiny little space for a year, looking for things that I could find. And then I got to watch stories play out in front of me. So I got to see things like a lynx spider and a little tiny fly with a white abdomen, and I got to see them interact in a way that worked out better for the spider than the fly. And I got to see the same thing with other creatures like this jumping spider and that ant, and it worked out about the same way for the spider and the ant. And the first ever photo I got of a tree frog in Nebraska happened in my square meter plot, which I thought was just tremendous. This is a species that's moving west across the state. It's been Aurora for a while, but I had never been able to find it and take a picture of it. I had people tell me it was on the screen door of their house, and I'd get over there and it'd be gone. And so I thought it was just really neat that the first time I ever actually got to see it and photograph it in Aurora was in this little square meter plot that I had. And then I usually end presentations about the square meter project with this photo, not because it's a tremendous photo, although it's fine, but because it kind of demonstrates one of the things that I learned out of the project, which was sort of the value of patience, I guess. So this is an ant on a Maximilian sunflower leaf, and the photo was taken in May when there wasn't anything really blooming in the plot at the time. I was early on in the project questioning whether it was worth me spending a bunch of time on this project. And I was looking for anything to take a picture of. And I saw the light coming through this leaf, and I thought, well, that's kind of neat. Maybe I can make something out of that. So I set up my tripod and my lens, and I started taking a picture of the leaf. And then while I did that, I noticed that there were ants running up and down the stem of the sunflower at the same time. And I thought, oh, that's pretty neat, because I know that ants feed on extrafloral nectar on sunflowers, which is this, sweet substance they produce outside the flower. And ants have a sweet tooth and they like it. So I thought, well, maybe that's pretty neat. Maybe I can get a picture of one of those ants on this leaf at the same time that I'm taking a picture of the leaf. And if I wait long enough, maybe something will come through. So I just sat there with my camera focused on this one single leaf. And it took about 10 minutes for it to happen, but it did happen. And I got the picture that I wanted. And it's not going to be an award-winning photo, but it was something that was very, very satisfying. And that sort of actually set me on a tone or on a path for the rest of the project of really being better about being patient, sitting still, waiting for things to happen in front of me, instead of what I usually do as a photographer, which is wander very actively and looking for things that are already happening. So I bring all this up because the project was fun to do. The square meter project was fun to do, and it would be easy to have the headline of the project be this, right? Scientist catalogs 113 species in a single square meter of prairie, which is an interesting fact. But if I've said anything that I hope stays with you today, is that facts are not usually the first step that we should have in a conversation, right? That's not the way you introduce yourself to somebody. And so I think what made the project resonate with people was the story that I was telling, because it was my wonderment, it was my sense of exploration and discovery, the stories that I told about the experience that I think made people care about the project. And I don't want to take too much credit for it because I really lucked into it. It was something I didn't know what I was getting into. It came around as the project came together as I did it. But it ended up being something that I think has been really instructive for me and I hope is helpful for others, which is that storytelling really matters. And the project resonated enough, it became a book. I'm actually working right now with the State Museum in Nebraska on a museum exhibit about the project, and be a 6-month sort of thing. It's crazy to me how much this has inspired other people. Like I hear all the time from people who are trying to do a project like this now because they saw me doing it. And I'm not the first one who's done a project like this. There are plenty of other people, including people in Iowa, who have done projects similar to this, right? Studying a small area to see what's there. So I'm going to end with this kind of recap, which is all of us, no matter who you are, what you do for conservation, have a responsibility and opportunity to tell your story. And the passion that you have, the questions that you have, the hope that you have, those are the things that people are going to connect with you on. And you can connect with people no matter what kind of audience it is, no matter what kind of platform you're using to talk to them. But please think about who are the audiences that you can reach, and then what are the things you're passionate about, and then go out there and tell your story. And hopefully, if all of us do that, we can start making a dent in the idea that we need to move people from the left side of the spectrum to the right side of the spectrum and get them to where conservation has a chance of success. So I'm going to end there, and we can have a discussion if there are people who have questions or comments.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That is wonderful as always, and always beautiful. So Barbara asks if you have thoughts on talking to ag business neighbors who may tend to interpret talk about Prairie as an implied criticism of agriculture. So basically how to balance that. Sorry to give you such a tough one right out the get-go.
It's a really interesting question. You know what? I have a lot of conversations with people in agriculture that I feel are pretty productive. I think farmers and ranchers, ranchers for sure, but and most farmers too, I think we don't give them enough credit for their motives, right? And it's easy and it's justifiable to be critical of agriculture and the way that agriculture is done right now. But I think talking to individual people or talking to people, well, yeah, just talking to individual people, they have their own reasons for what they're doing. They have stories, they have things that they care about. And if we can connect with them on that, that's a really good conversation starter, right? And so when I talk to people about prairies who aren't interested in prairies, again, it's the honest emotion that I have about what I care about that gets them to listen to me. And it's true with any topic and with any group of people. So I don't think agriculture is any different. I definitely have had plenty of conversations with people in agriculture, other industries where, yeah, their initial impression of me before I start saying anything is that I'm going to be very against everything that they do. And this is going to be a combative conversation. But again, if we can find that common ground of, hey, this is something that I care about, here's why I care about it, tell me what you care about, then that conversation can get started from there. So I think that would be the way I would answer that.
Great, thank you. And I can say as a private lands biologist that speaking with people in the ag community or farmers that are potentially taking ag out of production for something like CRP, even if they have CRP and you're out there with them, point stuff out, get them excited about it,
yeah,
tell them what's going on.
Yeah, if you can do it in the field, that's perfect. Exactly what you said.
Yeah,
People always
Oh.
like to know what they have on their property, right? Or to know what's around them and have that interpreted for them. Everybody likes that.
Yes, absolutely. Forming some sort of connection.
Yep.
So kind of more of a technical in terms of pictures. What hints do you have about keeping digital pictures organized or easy to retrieve, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of ways that I do that. First, storage is really important, right? You want to make sure you have multiple copies in different places so that if something happens to a machine of some kind, that you don't lose everything. So I have a couple of external hard drives that I keep in different locations that have my images on them. But organization is really interesting and tough. And I have a couple of different main methods I use. One is every JPEG, I have a low resolution version of every photo I've taken digitally since 2005 or something. And all of those are in one folder. And I can search that folder if I need to find a picture of purple prairie clover or of a Chinese praying mantis or whatever. And I can find it, and it's all within that folder. And I just use Microsoft Windows to do that. Now, the reason that works is that when I go through my photos and decide which ones I'm going to keep and then work them up in Photoshop, where I can, make minor edits or whatever, and then save them in different formats. Before I do all of that, I have a program called Photo Mechanic. And Photo Mechanic is one option. There's a lot of other ways, but it's a way to put embed metadata into your images. And you don't have to spend a ton of time doing it, but just putting in a few keywords, what is it? Where was it? And any other information that you think would be helpful later to find it makes a huge difference. And then those are embedded within that file, and I can go to that one folder and I can do that kind of search. That's great. The other thing that I do though is I have another set of folders where I've got them split into categories. And I use that when I'm putting together presentations like this one. So I'll have a category called invertebrates. And then within that, I'll have pollinators and I'll have beetles and I'll have grasshoppers. And that way, if I need a picture of a grasshopper, I can find it pretty quickly. And then I just have to scan through the, couple hundred grasshopper photos I have in that folder, rather than at least, going through the 10 or 20,000 photos of everything that I have. So I don't know if that helps, but that's the system that I use. But the metadata, getting the metadata in there is really important, and it's time consuming, but it's a lot less time consuming if you do it as you go than if you try to do it a bunch, all at the end later on.
And I'll also mention that I think it was about a year or more ago, Chris, that you did kind of a webinar training on taking photos and even doing tips with like photos on your phone. And I have a link to that. I don't know if you have a link to it handy that you could share, but
if you've got one, please share it. Yeah, that'd be
great.
Yeah,
I can share it after the meeting, but it was pretty instrumental even for me to be like, wow, I can step up my phone a notch.
Oh, great. No, I'm glad that was helpful. Yeah, that was the idea of it, right? Is that everybody has a different kind of camera. So I can't help everybody learn how to use their specific camera, but there's a lot of things that are common across all cameras that are helpful. So good. I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah. Another question. So there's been a lot of discussion in the chat on this question. So some people have thrown out some of their favorites. So I'll ask you, are there any other known professional scientists that you think are great at telling stories while communicating science, or, some of your go-tos or role models?
Oh, sure. Mike Forsberg in Nebraska has been one of the people that's been really instrumental with me. He's a good friend, but he was someone who, when I just got interested in photography, he was already pretty far along and was, has been a mentor of mine from the beginning, and not just from the photography standpoint, but really from the storytelling standpoint. A lot of what I'm talking about comes from him sort of whacking me over the head with this idea that you have to be a storyteller. You can't just take pretty pictures. So Mike Forsberg for sure, and the Great Plains book that he did, he's got the best book I've ever seen on sandhill cranes, and the Platte Basin time-lapse project that he does with Mike Farrell and a bunch of other people here in Nebraska. Just look up Platte Basin time-lapse, and it's much more than just time-lapse. It's a lot of really good storytelling about nature and conservation. So him for sure. People like Doug Tallamy, who have found ways to resonate with a huge audience. That's super impressive. I don't have an audience like that. But Doug's an entomologist who has written books that are super influential in terms of the way people see their backyards and people see conservation. So yeah, there are definitely people that do that, and there are many others that are, you know, people that I follow on Instagram or people I follow on Facebook who I don't think would see themselves as an influencer, but have a really nice knack of just sharing, you know, what they're seeing in day-to-day life, and they might have, you know, 300 or 400 people that are following them, and maybe 50 or 60 of those read the posts that they put up each time. But that's a really significant influence, and it's a really significant movement in the right direction with conservation. If everybody had 50 or 60 people that followed what they did and listened to what they were saying, that would be a huge impact. But so anyway, those are a couple of names that come right off the top of my head, but there are a lot of really good people doing this.
Awesome. Thank you. So Michelle asks, how do you keep up your mental, emotional energy, or how do you recharge as an introvert? And I have a feeling this is going to be a reoccurring question, folks.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a really good question. Because I do get burned out. I mean, everybody gets burned out. And my particular brand of being introverted is that, you know, I do need lots of time by myself. I need to have time wandering around by myself with my camera, but I also don't mind being in front of groups of people if I'm talking about something I'm comfortable with. That doesn't bother me too much. If I do it for hours and hours or days and days, then I need a break. But yeah, I'm able to recover myself by reading. I actually read a lot of things that aren't related to conservation. I read a lot of fiction, just because it's fun and it takes me out of my sort of conservation work world in a way that's really helpful. And then, you know, we've got some family land and some other prairies that are nearby here where I can go and explore and just, you know, shut everything out and just look for grasshoppers or look for bees or, you know, check out what's blooming, that kind of thing. Which is a pretty easy answer, I guess, from a prairie person, but prairies really do play a big role in helping me recharge.
Great, thank you. So a Simpson College Sustainability Club president is wondering, how can I get busy college-age students interested in caring and exploring nature, as well as talking about conservation and climate change?
Well, the hook is the biggest first thing, right? And I don't know the students you're working with, you know the students you're working with, but what is it that's going to hook them first? And it's probably not going to be, well, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes it is a lecture on carbon sequestration. Maybe that's a first step with college students. They're kind of a little bit of a unique audience because they are ready to be rallied around or ready to rally around something. But I think, you know, sticking with the theme of my talk, I guess, if you could get in front of them and talk about how much fun you had doing something out in the prairie, and sorts of some of the things you saw, and invite them to come with you and see them next time, that can be a really good starting point. And if you have several people that are all talking in the same way about how much fun it is to do this, you know, how much they're learning or how much, you know, how much they're seeing that they don't understand, and give people a chance to join in with that, you know, they might get excited by just the fact that people are already excited about something. So it's excitement that leads to more excitement. I think that would be my best starting point. And, you know, if you're doing that, you know, having somebody give a presentation with photos is always a good idea, but that's my way of doing it, right? So photography is really helpful, but not everybody's a photographer like we talked about. So it can just be as simple as, yeah, having people express their enthusiasm.
Absolutely. So have you considered comparing what you found in the square meter to what is in a square meter of a soybean field?
I definitely have had people ask me about that. My father-in-law is an agronomist. He's you know, one of the crop consultants that works with a lot of different farmers and helps them make decisions day to day on their agricultural work. And he's been a really good influence on me. I think, you know, he actually, and he's actually pretty good on Facebook, and he posts pictures of the things that he sees out in soybean fields, out in cornfields. And while it's definitely, you know, far from being a prairie, they're also not as sterile as you can be led to believe. I mean, he'll find upland sandpiper nests and insects that I don't recognize that turn out to be native insects that just happen to do well in soybean fields, or at least show up in soybean fields for a while. Anyway, I'm getting diverted, but it would be interesting to do it. I don't know that I've got the patience to do it, because it took a lot of my patience to look at a prairie, which I love, and where I knew I'd find a lot of things. I think staring at a soybean field square meter, I don't know that I'm the right person to do that. But if somebody else wants to do it, I would be happy to help sell the story.
Thank you. How do you select which species to share with your photography to engage a wide audience?
An easy question. Anything I can get a picture of. Pretty much that's true. I mean, I can't think of any species that I could take a picture of that lives in a prairie that I can't tell a good story about, because either I can, look it up, figure out what it is, have somebody help me identify it, and then, find information about it. Or if I can't do that, just the fact that I took a picture of it, I don't know what it is, and I wonder what it does. I can talk about where I saw it, what it was doing when I saw it, and try to draw some hypotheses out of that. And that's enough to connect with people, right? People are, again, you don't have to be an expert. And so I really can't think of anything that I've photographed that I couldn't use as part of a story that hopefully would bring people into conservation.
Great. Well, I think that's it for questions, and we're sitting right about 2:00. So
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I guess I shouldn't promise. Chris, are you hoping to be around for breakout rooms?
Yeah, I'll try to show up at 3. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I wish we could all clap.
Please don't.
But yeah, appreciate your time. So Stephanie has been a biologist with the Iowa DNR's Wildlife Diversity Program since 2005. She earned her master's from Iowa State University, studying butterfly communities in remnant and restored prairies. Her primary interests are in restoration ecology and conservation biology.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here and talking to this group. I have a lot to get through, so I'm going to forego the starting joke and just jump into this. This is definitely, after Chris's amazing talk, I'm feeling sort of self-conscious that this is not going to be very storytelling-ish, but I'll do my best. Bear with me. So with this first slide, it's normally the acknowledgement slide is at the end of the talk, but I really wanted to make sure to highlight all of these folks. Throughout the 2 projects I'm going to talk about, we had partnerships with Iowa State and Drake University. We had a bunch of really amazing land managers and land stewards out in the Loess Hills that were heavily involved in these projects, both with the DNR, the Nature Conservancy, as well as many private landowners. Katie Reeder dealt with all things grant-wise. The Iowa Butterfly Subcommittee comes into the story at a certain point, and I'll talk about that. But most importantly, there was an army of field technicians and butterfly stalkers that gave blood, sweat, and tears to collect these data. And I mean that literally. It was wonderful to work with them, and some of them have gone on to become a who's who in prairies. And I want to call out Carter, John, and Jessica specifically because they took a lot of amazing photos while they were out in the field collecting these data, and a lot of the photos you'll see in this program are from them as well. But the other reason I wanted to put this at the top is just to emphasize like how extensive this project was, and so there's a lot to go in. I'm actually not going to talk about the specifics about Prairie a whole lot, which is maybe a bold choice considering this is a Prairie conference, but I'm going to focus on the butterflies first and foremost. And, but they are so intertwined with this Prairie landscape and the Prairie vegetation that I think they're, kind of telling the same story as the Prairie. So things kind of started with these 2 individuals or these 2 species, though I think actually I need to back up a little bit further and talk about Powashik and Dakota skipperling. These two butterflies were the first in this area that were listed as federally endangered and threatened species. And if you're not obsessed with butterflies like I am, you may be wondering what a skipper is. And they're basically these small, stout bodied. They kind of have a lot of attitude. They're a little drab in their coloration. They tend to be sort of orange and brown. They're the little brown and orange jobs of the prairie. They can sometimes be mistaken for moths, but they're definitely butterflies, as you can tell by the little knobs at the end of their antennae. These two guys and the Powashik and Dakota are part of a group of skippers called the grass skippers. And a lot of the members of that group are really tightly associated with prairies, and not just any prairie, particularly remnant prairies. They, as their name suggests, they are primarily feeding as caterpillars on common prairie grasses, but they seem to really be tied to certain types of remnant prairies. And all of them are pretty much tanking. Other species kind of in this group are crossline skipper, common roadside skipper, Orogo skipper, long dash, wild indigo, dusky wing. And then these two guys are the Atoe skipper on the left and the Leonard skipper in the middle. And all of these species have kind of been going downhill. And we were talking in the Iowa Wildlife Action Plan Butterfly Subcommittee, which is a group of butterfly nerds that help with the Wildlife Action Plan and also, sort of review what's going on with butterflies in the state. And it became clear that we needed to kind of gather some more information. And the Atoe skipper was identified as a species that we really had some big concerns about. And then Leonard skipper was kind of a species that used the same types of habitats, had some of the same kinds of restrictions, but seemed to maybe be doing a little bit better. So that's what spawned the initial project I'm going to talk about that happened in 2024 and 2015. And then some of the results of that project spawned a second project in the Loess Hills that focused on a slightly more showy species, but also prairie dependent, the regal fritillary. So to talk about and just break down these two projects that I'm going to talk about and give a short intro. So the Atoe and Leonard's project happened in the summers of 2014 and 2015. We surveyed most of the historic sites for both of these species, as well as some potential sites that had good habitat that we thought where they might be. We conducted wandering surveys in the best habitat. We were mostly interested in getting presence data, and for a rare species that's hard to detect, a wandering survey is going to give you your best results. All butterflies that were seen were recorded, and also extensive habitat data was collected. The cheekily named Prairie Royalty Project focused on the regal fritillary and the monarch butterfly and their response to some management. So the focus of this grant that we got was to actually do some intensive management in the Loess Hills on these remnant prairies. And we wanted to look at, it was focused on improving the habitat for regal fritillaries and monarchs, and kind of, so the monitoring portion of it was to collect data before management happened in 2017, and then again in 2019 after the management had occurred. Again, as with the other survey, we recorded all butterflies that were seen, and we used slightly more formal survey methods, line transects, and visual encounter surveys, which are a little more structured. We also collected extensive habitat data with that project. All of these projects were mostly conducted in the Loess Hills, which, if you're not at all familiar with them, is a narrow band of hills that is primarily made up of loess, or silt, that was laid down in the last glaciation when the glaciers retreated. So there are these sharp hills. The soil in them is very nutrient poor. It's very dry, so it's not appropriate for agriculture. So because of that, a lot of remnant prairies have remained intact in this landscape, certainly much more so than in the rest of the area of the state. It's characterized by ridge lines with steep slopes and a lot of these fingers that come off the main ridge line. This aerial photo is kind of a good look at that. This is Five Ridge Prairie, which is over in, gosh, I'm forgetting the county name. It's north of Sioux City. And this is Broken Kettle up north of that. But you can kind of see how you've got like these open ridge lines with lots of trees kind of marching up the sides of it, but also those little fingers that come off the ridges. So that's kind of the landscape that we were mostly working in. Just to introduce you to the two main butterflies that we were working on, a toei skipper, they only have one generation per year. They're univoltine. They fly for about 4 to 5 weeks between late June and mid-August. Their host plants are little bluestem and Cytodes gramma, and they have kind of this mysterious relationship with echinacea. Basically, they start flying when the echinacea starts blooming, and that's kind of reliable. They overwinter in woven nests between blades of grass as a older caterpillar. The Leonard skipper, one thing I didn't have on here is there's actually 2 subspecies. There's Hesperia leonardus and Hesperia leonardus pawnii. And so I'll probably distinguish between them as Leonard's and Pawnee skipper, but they are subspecies of one another. They also fly once per year, and their flight period, though, is quite late in the summer. It's from mid-August to early October, so they don't start flying until after the toei skipper has stopped. They have the same host plants, but they do have that mysterious association again, but this time with rough blazing star. They also overwinter in woven nests between blades of grass, but as a very young caterpillar, as a first instar. These are the prairie sites that we were surveying. As you can see, most of them were in Western Iowa in the Loess Hills, but we had a few sites in Northwest Iowa and then also up in Northeast Iowa, particularly Alameda County. The objectives of the survey were to establish the current status and distribution of the species, investigate specific habitat associations and requirements to see if we could build kind of a habitat model and identify sites where these species may occur, but we haven't surveyed yet, and also develop a comprehensive recovery and management plan for each. We also wanted to, do a inventory of all the of all the species that are on these xeric prairie areas that we surveyed. So our results, the field technicians did over 1,000 surveys on 136 prairie survey parcels spread out over 58 properties. Each of the prairie parcels was surveyed between 1 and 15 times. Usually 3 to 4 times each season. So each for a toei and then for Leonard's. It was a total of over 1,000 survey hours looking for these butterflies, and that translated to about 31 minutes per acre. The results, which for the first objective was to establish the current status and distribution of these 2 skipper species. A toei skipper was only found on 2 properties and actually no properties in the Loess Hills. Only 4 individuals were identified, and these were all found in 2014 on 2 properties in Alameda County. This was with 630 hours of search time during their flight period of 123 prairie parcels. So pretty extensive surveys and only 4 individuals on 2 properties. And this is a species that just in 2004, in a research project out in the Loess Hills, the researcher was seeing hundreds of these. So it's been a very quick decline. The Leonard skipper, we had a little bit more luck with. We found 168 individuals on 21 sites. And 14 of those sites were new sites for Leonard skipper. So these were sites that maybe a towing skipper had been found on in the past, but not Leonard. So we did identify some new sites for them, which is great. One element for concern is the Pawnee subspecies. Only 2 individuals were found during the surveys. So this is a map of where the Leonard skippers were found, and you can kind of see the solid dots are where they were found, and the open dots were where they were not. And so we had a number of records over in eastern Iowa, and then the Loess Hills, primarily the records were from Monona and Harrison County. There were none found to the north, which is generally where we find Pawnee skippers, or where they were, their historic distribution was. But most of it was in the central to southern Loess Hills, which is generally where the Leonard's subspecies is found. So looking at other species, did we have much luck there? 77 species were recorded out of the 110 possible species in Iowa. So 70% of Iowa's butterfly species were found in these 2 years in the Loess Hills. 19 of those that were found are listed as species of greatest conservation need. And we even found a couple that were kind of strays. They don't normally occur in Iowa, and they just popped in. So Euphalla skipper, and then what's pictured here is a marine blue. The most abundant species of greatest conservation need was a regal fritillary, with over 652 individuals counted, and of course monarchs with over 2,000. For the habitat information and trying to figure out if we could build a habitat model, unfortunately, the species did not seem to really respond well or be associated much with landscape scale, like large scale characteristics. So they were, more about sort of the local characteristics. So the top 3 correlating factors with species abundance was the percent cover of liatris. Again, remember Leonard skipper has that association with liatris. The percent cover of bare ground, which they had a negative association with, and the percent cover of their host plants. So side oats, grama, and little blue stem. And then if you look at the difference between sort of the site-wide habitat characteristics versus the local characteristics, you can see significant differences. Therefore, so, the butterfly was choosing areas that had these specific characteristics that were different from the site-wide. So they were choosing areas with less vegetation density, with more liatris and percent cover of echinacea. They were choosing sites with a higher level of leaf litter, and then also a lower number of percent cover of forbs, which doesn't entirely make sense, but was what came out. So one of the results of this survey were not terribly heartening. A towing skipper is likely close to extirpated in Iowa, and it may be extirpated at this point. And unfortunately, we were trying to be proactive in getting out there and looking for the species. And I think, unfortunately, we were too late. Leonard's is not doing great, especially Pawnee, but it is doing a little bit better. And there is maybe, an opportunity to improve habitat for that species. The butterflies are really responding to very local, smaller areas of habitat rather than landscape. So building a habitat model for these species is going to be real hard. And woodland and forest is a really natural part of this Loess Hills landscape, but woody encroachment is a problem. And that's kind of what led to our, second project that started in 2017 that focused on monarch butterflies and regal fritillaries. The project was mostly focused on doing some intensive habitat management at Stone State Park, Loess Hills Wildlife Area, Loess Hills State Forest, and Waubonsee and vicinity down in Fremont County there. These are just some pictures of some of the habitat management done. You can see that huge swath of cedars that have been mechanically removed on what is likely an incredibly steep slope. It may not look like it in the picture, but it is. These are some of the piles of cedar that were burned. And then we also, in the lowlands, in the vicinity of some of these prairies, we also planted a diverse prairie mix. So our methodologies in looking for these two species, because they're bigger, showier, easier to detect, was transects and visual encounter surveys that we did pre-habitat management in 2017 and post-habitat management in 2019. The data was collected 3 times throughout the summer, and we also did intense quadrat-based habitat measurements. So with the regal fritillary, 99 individuals were recorded, and they were found on 6 of the 13 properties, though nothing south of Harrison County, which was sort of a curious thing we noticed in the Leonards and Etoe project, that for some reason they don't seem, they're at least in very low densities in the southern part of the Loess Hills. So if anybody has any different experience with that, let me know. Regal abundance, they were more abundant on areas that had the presence of their host plants, which are blue prairie violets and bird's foot violets. And they were lower on areas with greater canopy cover and also lower on areas that were burned. This is a noted thing in the literature that regal fritillaries don't respond well in the short term to prescribed burning. Their occupancy, or whether they occurred on a site or not, was really driven by the number of flowering plants that were at the site and also whether tree removal had been done. So they were positively correlated with areas that had that tree removal management. With monarch butterflies, we had quite a few more individuals recorded, and they were found on all 13 properties. They were mostly responding to milkweed on the site, and you can see the relationship there of greater chances of monarch occupancy as the percent cover of milkweed goes up. They also had a negative correlation with canopy cover, but they had a positive response to areas that had been burned because, of course, they're a migratory species. So they are coming in as an adult and aren't laying eggs and having that less mobile life stage in the prairies until after burning. Most of the burning has occurred. So overall response to management of, all plants and butterflies on each site, plant species richness was greater on areas after management, but plant species richness was a little bit lower. So what that means is that there were maybe fewer species that were found in 2019, but they were more evenly spread out or more evenly distributed throughout the landscape. Butterfly richness and diversity actually went down in 2019 versus 2017. So what exactly does that mean? And by the way, this picture is of 2 zebra swallowtails. Waubonsee State Park is one of the few places where you find this species, and this was a really cool photo. Those responses to management are sort of head scratching, but really basically what it's saying is that butterfly response to management is fairly nuanced. You can't necessarily look at the entire community of butterflies and know exactly what's going on with each species. Each species response to things is going to be different. We were also maybe hampered by the fact that we didn't really give it enough time as far as, there was management actually still going on in 2019, just because of the way these grant cycles work. They have to be done in 3 years. So, it would be great if we were collecting data this year to see how butterflies had responded in a little bit more longer time frame from the management happening. So my final thoughts here before I wrap up. We found over I think the final count between the 4 years was 83 species of butterfly, again, out of that, 110 total in the state. So 75% of the butterfly species that can be found in Iowa were found in the Loess Hills landscape. It is obviously a lifeboat for diversity. I don't think that's news to people, but it's a really important landscape, particularly for butterflies and probably prairie insects in general. The prairie skippers really, really need help, and they need some money invested in figuring out what's going on with them. They are declining quite rapidly, even in landscapes like this that look, fantastic and are fairly connected. And it's not, and they're also, they're declining range wide. So it's hard to know. Scientists don't really understand why. What's the driving force behind these really precipitous declines? And we just, there's not a lot of money being invested on figuring that out. We could also use more regular monitoring for butterflies and other insect species out in the Loess Hills. It would be great to figure out how we could get more of that done. And finally, there's management in these landscapes is incredibly difficult. And while our results here maybe don't suggest that it's, made a big impact for butterflies, I think in the long term, it probably will. And, we really need to invest in, knocking back the trees a little bit while keeping the trees that were probably a natural part of this landscape. And I think with that, I will say thank you. Thanks very much for giving me some time today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there's any time left. I know I was pushing it time-wise.
Yeah, I think we can fit a question in. We've got one, and if another one pops up, then we'll squeeze that in too. Okay. So first question, can you explain the role of remnant prairies? Why do these species not do well in restored prairies, or kind of,
Yeah, so that is a really great question, and it is the million-dollar question with related to these species. So first of all, we do have evidence that with the regal fritillary, that if you put their host plant, which is that blue prairie violet or bird's foot violet, into a reconstructed or planted prairie, they will do fine. But that is not the case with these prairie skippers, and we don't really know why. Usually butterflies are limited by their host plant. So, they can only occur where their host plant occurs, which is what the caterpillar eats. And in this case, it's, little bluestem and side oats grama, two pretty common prairie grasses that occur in a lot of reconstructions. But for some reason, these species do not occur there. They only occur not only on remnant prairies, but on remnant prairies in this midgrass prairie, dry, type of habitat. So they occur in the Loess Hills and they occur in Northeast Iowa on sort of the goat prairies. And nobody is entirely sure about that. And it's even, if anybody has some good ideas of how we could investigate this and figure it out, I'd love to know. That was part of the habitat data collection too, was to see if we could, if something would pop out that would explain why these species only can occur on these particular remnant prairies. And if we could figure that out, then we could potentially create more habitat for them and, or improve conditions for them. But currently we are not entirely sure why they're tied to those particular prairies.
Thank you. And I guess I'm just going to add that perhaps it's that mystery relationship between rough blazing star or the echinacea that also does well. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is there a community science option available for continued monitoring?
Possibly. And I think it would be really cool to explore that idea. I mean, skippers would be kind of hard, or would be a hard thing to teach. But, there's a lot of volunteers out there that are gung-ho and willing to learn that stuff and really do a deep dive into it, as well as there's probably some folks that would be willing to volunteer that are already huge, skipper maniacs that are really into butterflies and know how to identify these little guys. But yeah, I'd love to explore that. And again, it's a pretty time consuming undertaking, even to use volunteers.
All right.
Excuse me.
And the final question that everyone's
it.
getting.
Mhm.
Have
Yeah,
at it.
I have my answer ready because I've had 2 speakers before me. So how I keep my mental and emotional energy up or restore it is that I need to put a very clear barrier between what I do for my job and other things. I have a lot of interests outside of work. I just moved to an acreage and I'm trying to restore prairie there, and I garden, and I need to be able to keep work at work and put it aside. I'm unfortunately, I wish I was one of those people that could throw myself into conservation and my job, every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and really be the best biologist I could and save all the species. But yeah, mentally that would not work at all, because I also am a pretty hardcore introvert. So I like being able to step away and work on my own little piece of property in my own time, and try to find some recovery there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie.
Mhm.
I think for the sake of time, we're at a good minute mark that I can keep track of. If you want to answer John and Lisa's question in the chat, or Chris has got some suggestions too,
Okay.
feel free. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Reinaldo de Correa, maybe? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but is an artist with a multifaceted background in architecture and industrial design. Concepts about placemaking, storytelling, and the larger tapestry of a city through the artistic expression of the landscape are present in his art. With a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's in industrial design from Iowa State, Correa's experience includes working on interdisciplinary projects in the realms of architecture, design, and art. His work embodies multiple skills ranging from high-rise buildings, hospitals, recreational centers, rest areas, and schools to international public art in the US and Canada. Reinaldo strives to create pieces that push the boundary from just visual objects to artwork that evokes the human senses and the heritage of a site, highlighting the importance of ecosystem conservation, landscape care, and educational legacy. Currently, he teaches at multiple departments at Iowa State, the College of Design, bridging the gap between professional practice and academia. He also continues to develop projects nationwide through his private art practice, Reinaldo Correa Studio.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So it's Correa, but if you want to practice your Spanish, you can say Correa.
Oh, never good at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Alrighty, so once again, Sarah, thank you very much for that introduction. Truly excited, really excited to be here. I must say this this topic, right? Just the concept, right, of the conference itself, this idea of prairie kingship, right? This connection, right, towards our relationship to the prairie, nature, our natural heritage, has genuinely, truly been a key component in really shaping, right, my practice today, and my work in public art, right? So my goal really for today is that through this talk that I would be able to kind of share 3 lenses, right? These 3 lenses within the realm of public art that have truly given me a deeper appreciation, right, towards our natural heritage, right? And not only that, but it has also served as an opportunity to really echo these narratives and these stories. So I thought I'd start out by this idea of really allowing everybody to kind of ponder this question of what is public art? And if I could be frank, this is a definition that it's constantly evolving for myself. But if I could ask everybody to kind of really think about that, right? When you hear the word public art, what comes to mind, right? And I'm pretty sure for every artist it's different, right? But I would be hopeful that when thinking about public art, it's something that goes beyond this idea of sculpture, right? It is really this complex process that really involves multiple people. Not only that, but it's really about how the artwork is made, where it's located, the stories that it's also trying to kind of convey. And not only that, but this idea that it's a place that it's a form of art that gives meaning to a community. It's about the environment, how to transform a landscape, the values, the narratives that are important for a community. And, you know, one of the depictions that really come to my mind is back in 2008, I used to practice in the city of Chicago. And I would always look forward to my lunch break and just walking down to Millennial Park and just sitting down and observing the power. Back then, I didn't even know about the term public art. And I would sit near these crown fountain, right? This large piece of artwork designed by Jaume Plenza that would just spit water, and seeing kids, no matter if they were from the north side of Chicago, the south side, no matter the color of their skins, if they were Black, Latino, white, they were all kind of converging into this one location in laughter and memory. And there was something just so amazing that captivated me and began to allow me to understand that art, right? Unfortunately, for some, it's seen as an amenity. And I believe that it has the power to do these types of things. So I am not originally from Iowa. I'm actually from an island in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. And I'm from this little small town called Humacao. And again, I come from a completely different ecosystem. I grew up seeing, right, hiking through tropical forests and so on, climbing mango trees. And life took me through this journey of arriving to Ames, Iowa, a place that now I call home. Been living in the Midwest, specifically in Iowa, for over 18 years. And my 3 children have been born here. And I want them to really understand kind of the heritage and the value that we all have. And for me, it was always interesting that coming from Puerto Rico, when I would ask about Iowa, this was the narrative that I was given, right? And there's nothing bad about this narrative. It's quite beautiful, right? The corn crops, the vernacular of the farms, but little did I know that there was so much more to Iowa and our natural heritage than just this. It was through my studies of architecture that I stumbled upon this artist called Grant Wood. And it was just amazing, right? This artist from the 30s was, right, depicting through his artwork these ideas of traditional farming, ideas of the beauty of Iowa, right? Ideas of these native species that I had never heard before. The relationship of the people to the land were also incredible topics that really captivated me and allowed me to see a different lens of Iowa. So once again, this first lens that I want to talk about is this idea of connecting to Iowa's natural heritage through its people, right? So this idea that we have to be ambassadors of this message that we're trying to kind of provocate and tell these stories to help empower and create, if you will, this desire for application and change. I was impacted by my mentor and good friend, David Dahlquist, in his studio, RDG Dahlquist Art Studio. And as an apprentice for 5 years, he introduced me to this world of public art. And it was just astonishing the way that David would speak about the Midwest, right? He would speak about this natural heritage and just nature. And again, it was just extremely fascinating the way he would emanate this passion towards the Midwest. So together we had the opportunity to work on this project right off of I-380, this project called A View from Our Window in Lynn County. And that artist that as a student I stumbled upon now became the essence of the work. Grant Wood and, right, this movement of regionalism, these artists that in the midst of the 30s, right, they kind of took their attention off of the war and wanted to really depict, once again, this beauty, the rolling hills of Iowa, something that I had never experienced in Puerto Rico, this changing of seasons and the way the landscape changes, these amazing configurations in the landscape, and once again, our relationship to it. It was also amazing that Grant Wood was also kind of really portraying this message and dedicating, right, this knowledge and this message to his students, right? They would gather in Stone City and kind of in these wagons, and they would kind of depict these beautiful images, right, of the landscape. So in this project, we were working with the Iowa Department of Transportation for this rest area. And it was just a great opportunity as a rest area to create this theme that as people would stop in this rest area, they would be able to pause and see a totally different lens of Iowa, right? So you had these rolling hills on the front of the facade of the architecture that would kind of intersect with the facade, and it would spill into this beautiful pattern in this terrazzo floor. You had these amazing Gothic windows with native plant species that would speak about the importance of the prairie. You had these picnic shelters inspired by those wagons where the students would portray, right, these ideas of the landscape. The seating became hay bales where many farmers, right, spend countless hours, right, in the labor and enjoyment of the land. There's also at the horizon these beautiful silhouettes that would frame the beauty of the landscape. There's this relationship to light and how light became a part of that narrative. In the facade of these buildings, there were these clay kind of snippets of Grant Wood's work. You can see here some of these early renditions of these ideas, right? And how light became part of the narrative of the changing of seasons. And this is the translation once we built. So again, the use of color LED changing lights to begin to kind of create, if you will, that ambiance and that narrative. As people would kind of walk through this rest area, they would be able to experience the rolling hills. There are kind of opportunities, if you will, of play. As I mentioned before, the idea of the shelter being an opportunity to kind of talk about that legacy and that history, but also creating these vignettes of Grant Wood's work. So when light would hit these vignettes, his work would cast once again back to the land. The terrazzo floor of the architecture would kind of depict those beautiful aerial views, right, of these different configurations of the land and paying homage to his 5 Turner Alley studio. We use humor as well, right? Typically, this is kind of the main function of the building. So the restrooms, the men and the women, right? Being able to kind of depict, if you will, the grand personalities in the American Gothic painting. So again, the translation, once again, of that vision. As you walk towards the end of the rest area, this little beautiful opportunity of looking through these silhouettes and being able to frame that beauty of the land. The second lens that I wish to kind of share with you all is being able to kind of connect, right, through this natural heritage, through the research, work, and passion of others. This has been truly instrumental in my work, allowing the work of others to truly inspire my own and to begin to kind of build upon the platforms that have been established before mine. There was a competition this was the Lau Park Arts and Environmental Center, where they had these great efforts of conservation, right, of restoring the prairie and the oak savanna. And you can see it a little bit here within this satellite view. They invited about 75 artists to compete to create this gateway in order to kind of speak about these efforts. Again, this was all foreign to me. I learned, right, as time here in Iowa, that the prairie was Iowa's most diverse and most complex ecosystem. So there's something to be learned about this. I did not know this before, right? So I'm right now preaching to the choir, but a young man coming from Puerto Rico to Iowa, this is all a totally new narrative that needs to be exemplified, and to kind of learn that 70 to 80% of the land was once covered with this beautiful native species, and to understand that today, I believe that there's less than 0.1% in the land. That was just amazing for me to kind of to be able to kind of witness, right? And I think Christine Nobiss was talking about that, right? The impact of how big agriculture has impacted this, right? And these kind of inefficiencies of land use was something that, again, really captivated my attention. But it was the work of John E. Weaver, right? Originally from here, from Iowa, taught at the University of Minnesota. And this is back, I believe, in the 30s, right? Actually, yeah, I believe at the 1913s or so. And what was amazing about John Weaver's work was that he would cut these trenches 15, 20 feet deep to be able to kind of study, right? As a botanist and plant ecology professor, that was his passion and his research. And he would create these beautiful drawings of, he coined the term prairie underground, and he would speak about the benefits of the prairie, and photograph and document that. And I said, wow, this is truly something amazing that needs to continue to kind of resonate. The research also of National Geographic, right, in Kansas City, and once again, very similar to John E. Weaver, cutting these trenches and really photographing, right, the kind of complexity that exists within this prairie underground, right, this intricate root system. So this became the premise of the inspiration of the artwork, right? This idea of this seed, right? And this cycle, right, of germination, and this plant that grows and the benefit that it has to the land, and these kind of metaphors of regeneration, right, through these controlled fires and these ideas of rebirth. It's a metaphor that relates to us also as people, right? And I thought it was something very evocative to really talk about and begin to allow people to kind of question. So this is where Prairie Revival became kind of a proposition for this park. So again, Prairie Revival, you can begin to see kind of this manifestation, right, of this cycle, and being able to become this gateway to this park. And I believe Stephanie Shepard was talking about this. I love this idea of, I think she coined it, lifeboat of diversity. And basically the impact that the prairie has to these different species, right? And if you will, this spiral, right, this cycle is dematerialized with these narrative patterns that begin to evoke this part of the story. I soon started doing prairie walks and kind of utilizing that as also as part of the inspiration. And eventually even the color palette of the artwork became inspired by that. A lot of complexity came in such a piece, right? So use of computational design was utilized in order to create this intricate spiral that, again, from a manufacturing standpoint, it's quite difficult to make metal bend in such a way. Here you can see some of that fabrication process, right, of basically plasma cutting these narrative patterns and beginning to kind of bend the steel to create that metaphor of those cycles. These narratives, right, the way light begins to interact with the artwork and project to the land. And because of the complexity of the artwork, we actually had to fabricate it sideways. So it's always fascinating, right, when the public would actually pass through the fabrication shop, they actually thought we were building a gigantic slide. So I had to try it out. And here you can begin to see just the piece beginning to really take form, and seeing how the computational aspects took fruition in the fabrication. And here you can begin to see the artwork, Prairie Revival. And it's just a beautiful piece that as you're walking towards this park, you can begin to see how it complements already the goals of this place. It kind of, if you will, begins to peek out, and the closer you get to the site, it begins to reveal itself. And the spiral begins to create a spatial experience that kind of encourages the user to kind of, if you will, partake and to be able to, if you will, pause and look at these narratives. Here we see Prairie Revival at the entry. The last lens that I wish to share with you all is something that is now really dear to me as both a teacher, right? You feel a great responsibility to really empower that next generation, going back to that notion of really becoming ambassadors and mentors and really pouring out this message. I competed on another competition for the Polk County Conservation in Granger, Iowa, where, again, the vision for this particular place is quite remarkable. As you're entering the site, you're kind of entering kind of these efforts of regenerating the prairie, these amazing principles of conservation for, bisons and elk, and a very, very unique site here in Iowa that encompasses these three ecosystems: the prairie, the wetland, and the woodlands. And as I was seeking inspiration for this particular piece of artwork, I noticed that on the site, these pine trees were dying. And I always knew about annual rings, but I had no idea that if you look at the sectional quality of a tree trunk, it also tells stories, right? When you begin to see these annual rings closer together, they're indicative of drought. You can begin to see scars in these sections, right? Indicative of perhaps a fire, or these marks, right? If they've kind of gone through any insect plagues. And I just thought that it was amazing that within that sectional quality of that trunk, you would be able to it tells stories. And we live in a day and age that there's so much noise. As a father of three, I feel a responsibility to really empower my children to embrace nature, right? That there's more to life than just video games. And, that was one of the things of really wanting to work with middle school children and to allow them to immerse themselves in these different ecosystems and to really become, if you will, the inspiration of these narratives. So as we were walking through, right, these different ecosystems, being able to appreciate these narratives. Beautiful pictures here. You can see kind of the bison, the conservation efforts, the bisons, just being able to immerse themselves in the site. This became the proposition, this tree-like structure with these rings, and these corten steel rings became the platform for those narratives. There's these droplets that become reflective in nature, which kind of poses, right, that duality of that physical reflection, but also that reflection or that introspection of really questioning the viewer, what is your role, or what role would you wish to partake in these ideas of conservation? I held a workshop, and this was just an incredible experience where, again, they began to depict, right, these ideas, that experience of being able to experience firsthand these ecosystems and what should the narrative of these ribbons or these annual rings should be. And again, fascinating, you can see some of these depictions of the children, right, these middle school children depicting, right, the prairie, the bisons, the different, species in the wetlands and so on. And here we see whispers of nature, right? So these annual rings, that desire of capturing these whispers that they encounter as they were experience the site. The top one, the woodland, the middle one, the prairie, and the one on the bottom, the wetlands. Finally, now with my college students, I have this genuine desire of continuing to bridge the gap between academia and professional practice. And this was a really kind of transformative project for me, where I had the opportunity to collaborate with our extension and outreach, and also Ryman Gardens. We really wanted to put an interdisciplinary team together of basically students from architecture, industrial design, art, engineering, but also scientists, right? Botanists, horticulturists, all of us, educational specialists, all of us coming together to use this idea of play to help really educate the public, right? In a very kind of fun manner. So we actually developed 13 different projects. I'm just going to go over a few of them, right? This first one being the bead maze, which was for a younger public, right? So more for toddlers. But this idea that what if we kind of create this kind of a piece that would kind of allow kids to really learn about pollination, that through the act of experiential learning, right, that it could be fun, that it could be immersive, right, in the experience. So here were some of the renderings, right, of that particular vision. So you would have a 3D printed bee, and you would pass it along these flowers and these different species and begin to kind of create, right, this idea of pollination. And this was the kind of final fruition of that particular piece. This other one, inspired by puzzles, right, called Cause and Effect, where it was this idea that you would have this puzzle, and this puzzle was kind of, it had two faces, where on one end, for instance, you would have, for instance, a wetland, and you would be able to kind of see this wetland kind of going through pollution, right, caused through agricultural or industrial runoff. You would have waste products in it. And as you would solve this puzzle, right, on the other side, it would rearrange itself, and you would see the restoration, right, of that biome. So here you could begin to see kind of the essence of that particular game, that toy and game of this particular kid trying to solve, quite actually complex, but again, fascinating to be able to see those outcomes. There was this other one we called Morphing Morphology, which became an opportunity to kind of really speak about this idea of learning about the structure and forms of plants. It was kind of almost like a kaleidoscope. It would kind of produce these amazing colors as well on the ground. And here you see a mom with her children, right, trying to kind of create those connections. Photosynthesize, right, this idea of a game that kind of really forces us to connect, to work together, to learn about the process of photosynthesis, right? And you would have to kind of, through this maze, reach these different steps. The concept and then the fruition, right? So here we see a group, right, really working together, and there's this little marble throughout that would kind of really encourage them all to kind of reach those 6 phases. Of course, we had to have a chess, right? This was kind of inspired by the food web and this idea that each organism is affected by another, right? So the pond being a dandelion or a clover, the rook being a stink bug, and so on. This is the final fruition of the particular piece. Finally, we created these 5 pieces, right? There were these pieces that were kind of almost like a scavenger hunt, an I Spy, and they were all inspired by 5 biomes. One of them was inspired by the Midwest Prairie, another one the Sonoran Desert, the Smoky Mountains, the Florida Everglades, and so on. And there's these beautiful pieces where the kids would have to kind of go with a map and begin to kind of, through this abstract cut pattern, they would need to kind of identify and find, right, these different fauna and flora from these different biomes. So once again, right, these 3 lenses that I talked about have been extremely vital to my practice. It not only has been vital to the practice, but it has also given me an appreciation towards our natural heritage, right? So number one, really connecting to Iowa's natural heritage through our people, from allowing the research and the work and the influence of other people's work to impact your own. And finally, to be able to allow yourself to really sow seeds into the next generation on this message. That's something that I take a lot of pride on, right? As a teacher, that there's a responsibility of being able to echo this message and to allow them to partake in that process, to not only tell the narrative, but to become part of that narrative. And I have found that that has become very instrumental in being able to appreciate and wanting to partake more in these types of activities and events. So thank you very much.
Oh my gosh, thank you. That was absolutely gorgeous. Really appreciate that. We have Lucy who's wondering where, so the nature of the game, I can't remember what it's called, where are those located?
Sure. So those are kind of in a 5-year, they're kind of rotating around the state. They started here at Iowa State at Ryman Gardens. Then they headed to Florida to a garden called Lou Garden. And right now, I am not sure in which other garden they're at. So I'll need to do a little digging on that. But again, the idea is that they would be rotating through different gardens throughout the nation for the next 5 years.
Will they have kind of a resting place after the 5 years?
You know, that's a great question. They would probably land back here at Iowa State. But, you know, I think those are conversations that I really need to embrace, right? In terms of what is the long-term goal for these. Again, it's just been amazing to kind of just see those interactions. As an artist, I find a lot of pleasure sometimes just sitting down at a site and beginning to see how people immerse themselves in that process. And I think there's just a lot of value, as I was sharing through the talk, in terms of experiential learning and whatnot. But to answer the question, I'm not 100% certain, and I think those are conversations that I need to embrace once this 5-year period is done. Again, COVID, slowed down kind of some of the rental of the exhibit, but my understanding that it has picked up once again.
Sure. And the question you should be waiting for: how do you keep your mental emotional state positive? How do you refuel your tank?
Yeah, for me, it's that ability to be able to pause, right? I was mentioning, right, while I was describing Whispers of Nature, like we live in a day and age where there's just so much noise, right? And we're being pulled in so many different directions. And, a lot of this work, right, it really just demands so much of you. And for me, it has been being able to just pause and just disconnect, and being with family, embracing my faith. And those have been just truly instrumental in this process, because again, it's very arduous when you look at a project like this. There's about 1.5 years, right, from the design of the work to the fabrication to the installation. And there's so many stakeholders in this process that, yes, it could take a toll. But the ability to kind of just pause and be able to kind of come back with a fresh new perspective toward things has been extremely crucial for me.
Yes, absolutely. And for people to find more of your art, do you have a website, or is Instagram, is there a place outside of social media perhaps where we
Sure,
can find
yeah,
you?
absolutely. So my site right now, we just started reconstructing it, but what I'll do is I'll put some links on our chat, and yeah, you could email me and you can kind of follow some of those links, and I would be more than glad to connect.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the speakers opening up and being a little vulnerable and answering that important question that Michelle keeps posing. So thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Holds a BA from the University of Iowa and a MNS from the University of South Dakota and a PhD from the University of Iowa. Daryl served as head of the biology department at the University of Northern Iowa for 7 years and directed UNI's Tallgrass Prairie Center programs for 11 years. He has written and or contributed to over 15 publications. In 1990, Daryl created and implemented the Iowa Ecotype Project, which has been invaluable to prairie restoration within the state. He has also been influential in bringing the North American Prairie Conference to UNI. He directed the 12th and 22nd NAPC, North American Prairie Conference, and numerous Iowa Prairie conferences over the years. Currently, Daryl continues to teach prairie ecology at Iowa Lakeside Laboratory and remains active with a number of groups.
All right, thank you. Well, Iowa, with more than 80% of the original prairie vegetation comprised of tallgrass prairie, is probably more deserving of the name Prairie State than Illinois. However, with less than 0.1% of the original prairie remaining, many are unaware of the magnitude of the original Iowa prairie and how rapidly it disappeared. The state began losing prairie shortly after it was settled in 1832. If one extrapolates from the annual data of wild hay harvest to estimate the amount of prairie each year, there was approximately 4% remaining at the turn of the 20th century when Iowa was considered settled. Prairie remnant had been further reduced to 0.7% when I was born in 1938 and to 0.4% a decade later when Hayden Prairie was dedicated as the first state preserve. The decline in prairie remnants occurred and still occurs today, although occasionally a previously unknown remnant will be discovered. I'm sure several of you could relate examples of remnants lost in the past 50 years. I know I have personally cried and gnashed my teeth over the loss of prairie remnants. Consequently, there isn't much prairie remnant remaining on the landscape that was once dominated the Iowa landscape in 1800. As a native of Southeast Iowa, I never knowingly visited a prairie until the summer of 1964 as a 26-year-old graduate student at the University of South Dakota. I fell in love with prairie that summer. My interest in prairie was suspended as I pursued a PhD at the University of Iowa and a plant physiology dissertation on the role of pectin methylesterase in abscission. In the fall of '67, I joined the biology faculty at the University of Northern Iowa. My interest in prairie was rekindled in 1970 when Glenn Crum, a graduate student, persuaded me to visit a prairie now known as the Cedar Hill Sand Prairie that he had rediscovered near Cedar Falls. Sparked by my interest in prairie, I soon became aware of the restoration work being done by Paul Shepard and Pete Schramm at Knox College and Paul Christensen at Cornell. This motivated me to plan and initiate a prairie reconstruction project on the campus at the University of Northern Iowa in 1973. From then on, I became increasingly involved, some might say obsessed, with tallgrass prairie and prairie restoration. Today, I want to share some prairie recollections and reflections regarding the past half century. And I must say, when I chose this topic, I had no idea how big it was going to be. So it's more recollections than reflections. We might have to spend a whole evening reflecting, and maybe we can do that some other time. Historically, the efforts of Shimmick and McBride at Iowa U and Hayden, Pamela, and Eichmann at Iowa State and the Iowa Academy of Science Conservation Committee provided a firm foundation and a legacy for prairie studies and preservation in the state. As a basis of the Iowa Academy of Science Prairie Project, Hayden surveyed in the mid-40s, surveyed numerous prairie areas in Iowa and recommended for preservation 22 sites in 10 counties, totaling approximately 6,000 acres. As I entered the world of prairie in Iowa in the early 1970s, activities were mostly oriented towards locating and preserving remaining prairie remnants. There were 4 major remnants that had been preserved in Iowa at that time, and you can see them listed there: Hayden, Kelso, Kaler, and Sheeter. Prairie reconstruction was in its infancy. Jake Landers had persuaded the Iowa DOT to plant some native grass species in the right-of-way to Interstate 80, and Paul Christensen was establishing some small prairie plantings near Cornell College and in a roadside planting in rural Lynn County. Organizations dedicated to prairie and prairie preservations were limited in number. There was some preservation by individuals, but there was no guarantee of long-time protection of these areas. The Iowa chapter of Nature Conservancy had been formed in 1963. The Frida Hafner Kittle Hole was one of the first acquisitions in 1972. The Iowa legislature had established the State Preserves Advisory Board in 1965. The 4 previously mentioned prairies had been designated as state preserves. Although lacking acquisition funds for preserves, the board was encouraging county conservation boards and others to preserve representative prairies. The pace of prairie-related activities of the Preserves Board increased in the mid-1970s with the designation of Dean Rosa as the state ecologist and board advisor. Rosa, encouraged by the board members Sylvan Runkle and Dorothy Behringer, stimulated prairie awareness and preservation. In the 13-year period from 1976 to 1989, 19 different prairie remnants were preserved, totaling 1,849 acres. Dean also conducted a personal survey reconnaissance of other potential preserves and encouraged establishment of the annual Prairie Heritage Week. In addition, he and the board guided development of a 1981 2-year agreement between the Nature Conservancy and the Iowa Conservation Commission, later DNR, to initiate the Iowa Natural Areas Inventory, modeled on the TNC Heritage Program. The INAI staff initiated a survey of prairie remnants in selected areas of Iowa. During 1983 and 84, they located and gathered basic ecological data on prairies in the Loess Hills, Northeast Iowa Hill Prairies, and large black soil prairies. This comprehensive survey examined and verified the existence of 49 prairie remnants that have been reported to the INAI but not previously documented. The INAI shape changed as it was incorporated into the Iowa Department of Natural Resources as the Ecological and Preserves section. Over the years, as this unit was shuffled around DNR, staff members John Pearson and Daryl Howell provided continual ongoing support to the State Preserves Advisory Board. This allowed the Preserves Board to function, although many are of the opinion that the State Preserves has never fully received the state funding it deserves and needs, and for funding and personnel that it really needs. The Nature Conservancy in Iowa works to preserve our state's natural landscapes through the advancement of land and water conservation, as it was a volunteer organization for the first 10 years. Larry Eiler, chair of the board from 72 and 73, spearheaded a successful effort to obtain a full-time TNC staff member for the state. It has increased from 1 staff person in 1973 to a staff of 21 state field office personnel and project managers across the state who work to protect and conserve private lands and work with agriculture producers and companies on best conservation practices. They have protected through ownership, transfer to conservation agencies and conservation easements, 13,997 acres of prairie in the Loess Hills, Little Sioux Valley, and other locations in the state. The Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation was founded in 1979 to protect and restore Iowa's natural areas with the capability to act quickly to acquire protect areas when they became available. In the past 4 decades, under the leadership of Jerry Schneff, Mark Ackelson, and Joe McGovern, it has developed into a premier conservation organization. With a current staff of 27, they are involved in 4 areas of activity: land, water, and wildlife protection, land stewardship and management, a trails program, and conservation policy. In the past 42 years, they have protected prairie via ownership, transfer to conservation agencies and conservation agents, 10,035 acres of remnant prairie in Northeast Iowa and the Blufflands, Bluckman Prairie, and other locations throughout the state. When the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation was initially formed, there was a concern that their work would be in conflict with the Iowa Prairie TNC, handicapping natural areas preservation. This concern proved to be unfounded, as both complement one another and often work jointly with other entities to preserve prairies. A good example is the Waterman Prairie Project in the Little Sioux Valley. In addition, other organizations have become involved in prairie preservation protection, including county conservation boards and organizations like the Burr Oak Trust, started in Johnson County. Collectively, the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, TNC, DNR, and many of you have protected approximately 27,032 acres of Iowa prairie in the past 50 years. That is an impressive accomplishment. In 1998, I estimated that less than 0.1% of native prairie remained. Either we have protected almost all the native prairie remaining, or I need to reconsider raising my estimate. When I first became involved in prairie activities, I felt that I was aware of all the prairie activities in the state. Today, I can say that is no longer true. There's been a great increase in the number of groups and organizations and individuals involved. The Iowa Prairie Network was formed in 1990 at the 12th North American Prairie Conference at UNI. Their mission is to learn about, teach about, enjoy, and protect Iowa's prairie heritage. Their activities have waxed and waned over the past 30 years, but they have remained a constant promoter of prairie and prairie activities, supporting prairie conferences, assisting in the purchase and management of prairie remnants, championing Iowa Prairie Heritage Week, and organizing prairie walks. They hold their annual meetings during the summer, and the annual winter seminar has developed into a de facto state meeting of prairie enthusiasts. IPN's involvement with the organization and planning of this conference indicates that they are ready for another 30 years. As indicated previously, prairie restoration and reconstruction were early interests of mine. In 1973, I seeded 8 acres of prairie on the University of Northern Iowa campus. In retrospect, it's obvious that I made many mistakes in the process. However, I was able to benefit from the advice of folks like Paul Christensen and Jake Landers and learning from my mistakes. After all, isn't durable learning not repeating your mistakes? The term prairie restoration includes 2 different processes, although it's often used for both. One process is restoration, upgrading existing degraded prairie remnants, and other processes is reconstruction, establishing a prairie community on a site with no existing prairie species. Restoration involves improving prairie communities which have some of the natural components remaining, the techniques, and some of the natural components still surviving. Techniques to enhance prairie are applied to the degraded site that retains the existing prairie remnants. Restoration techniques may vary in complexity depending on the degree of degradation and what relic species remain, but the goal is to attempt recovery of the original biota. This may include using management practices that favor prairie, introducing additional species to the site. A key point of differentiating this process from the other process is the enhancement of the vestige of the prairie that remain. On the other hand, reconstruction consists of starting a prairie from scratch. No prairie components are present on the site when the reconstruction process is started. The site may or may not have previously contained prairie, but no vestiges of prairie remain. Therefore, the entire prairie must be recreated by preparing the site, planting seed, controlling weeds, managing succession, and supporting the rebuilding of the soil. Prairie seed and/or seedling transplants are imported from other locations and added to the areas. Prairie restoration and reconstructions, particularly reconstructions, differ considerably from one end of a continuum to the other. At one end are the relatively small, simplified, stylized natural landscape used in residential and industrial sites to create of the visual essence of native prairies. This may include prairie plantings used in parks and on roadside for enhanced aesthetics, weed control, erosion control, and reduced maintenance costs. I often refer to them as working or applied prairies. At the other end of the spectrum are the nearly complete facsimiles of original prairie communities. I must say that there's been a dramatic increase in prairie reconstruction in the past half century. It began at the University of Wisconsin in the 30s and 40s, spread slowly in the 50s, before increasing in popularity in the 60s and early 70s. People developed prairie lawns, and as I said, business and industry began landscaping with prairie on grounds of their corporate headquarters and manufacturing sites. Local entrepreneurs started businesses to sell prairie seed. My seeding of the prairie, of the UNI Camps Prairie in 1973, is an example indicative of being caught up in the surge of enthusiasm for prairie reconstruction. The possibility of reconstructing your own prairie patch has an infectious aspect. Over the years, I've observed numerous students and other individuals catching the prairie fever and becoming highly motivated to learn more about prairies. Surprisingly, this early interest in prairie reconstruction has continued to increase over the past half century, with many more prairie enthusiasts planting prairie today than 50 years ago. More homeowners are planting small prairies in their yards. Many cities and businesses, churches, and various agencies are landscaping with prairies. Prairies are planted on roadsides. Rain garden prairies are established to control water runoff, and many farmers are planting prairies through the Conservation Reserve Program. Paralleling this increase in the number of prairie patches has been the corresponding increase in magnitude of prairie reconstruction projects. When I planted the UNI prairie camps in 1973, large projects were measured in tens of acres. In 1975, Bob Betts and his Northeast Illinois group increased the magnitude by a factor of 10 with the first planting of a proposed 650-acre reconstructed prairie at Fermi Lab in Batavia, Illinois. Currently, the Fermi Lab prairie consists of 1,200 acres. 2.5 decades after that, larger reconstruction appeared on the scene. Most prominent were the 8,600-acre prairie and savanna reconstruction and remnant restoration project that began in 1991 at Neil Smith, originally Walnut Creek National Wildlife Refuge near Des Moines, and the multi-community reconstruction and remnant restoration project initiated in 1996 on 1,900 acres at the Medawin National Tallgrass Prairie near Joliet, Illinois. In the past half century, practitioners of prairie restoration and reconstruction have made significant advances in reconstruction procedures and techniques. Initially, some folk spread prairie hay harvested from a remnant prairie over a site as a seed source. Initially, stands of native grasses such as switchgrass or a mixture of big blue stem Indian grass and switchgrass. Little or no concern was given to prairie forbs, as most of the available seed consisted of native grass cultivars developed for rangeland restoration. Changes in the last 50 years include reduction of seeding rates of prairie grasses by 5 times or more, from a high of 28 to 40 pounds of seed per acre. Increased availability of seed of a greater variety of species. Also, we're now designing prairie seed mixtures with specifies of seeds per unit area. For example, a number of seeds per square foot for each species. There's been more use of forbs to provide a 50-50 grass forb ratio. We began adding sedge seed to mixes. The height of established mowing has been lowered and the frequency increased. Extensive tilling for site preparation has been replacement with glyphosate application or overseeding. And there's more attention being given to drilling depth of seed. And there's an increased concern about prairie predation after planting. Some reconstruction projects are being fall seeded, but most are still seeded in the spring. Native seed production changed from a hobby to a business operation. As a result, high quality source identified seed is more readily available at reasonable prices and is increasingly used in plantings. Consequently, the use of Western cultivars and non-local ecotypes has been reduced. Unfortunately, novices looking for a deal can still buy prairie seed mixtures containing species not endemic to a particular area. Almost all of the prairie reconstruction and restoration projects in Iowa have focused on plants with little attention to animal, fungi, and microbes, sort of based upon the idea if you build it, they will come. In some instances that works, but certain organisms need help considering the isolation and relative size prairie patches in an agricultural landscape. Many of the advances in prairie restoration techniques have been the result of trial and error or fortuitous experiences involving little use of scientific methodology. Information regarding these procedures and techniques has been largely anecdotal and disseminated via word of mouth by practitioners. Most of the anecdotal information is valuable, but not always repeatable. On the other hand, academic research is of limited use without a management context. This has led to the general opinion that standardized methods cannot be developed for prairie reconstruction and remnant restoration because of variations in weather, be it seasonal, annual, sporadic past history of the site, and physiographic differences of soil as well as impact of adjacent land. Consequently, there's some tension between prairie restoration practitioners and restoration ecologists regarding methodology. Maintaining open interface of communication between the two via conference and collaborative projects is essential as we continue to learn more about reconstruction and restoration. We need to continue to test information generated by practitioners to develop prairie restoration principles that can be successfully applied by all practitioners. Restoration and reconstruction principles will help avoid the perpetuation of mythical planting guidelines, untenable time recommendations by agencies, and seed mixes of unsustainable flowering spices. Authors of a project that will eliminate a prairie remnant will propose that a prairie be reconstructed elsewhere to replace it. We must dispel any possible impression that reconstructed prairies can replace prairie remnants. Like Ray Schulenberg, creator of the excellent reconstruction at Morton Arboretum, we must continue to remind ourselves and others that we can't provide all of the elements. The complexity and size of the original prairie renders it impossible to recreate an exact facsimile. Obviously, more diverse collections of plants, animals, and microbes persist in an intact prairie remnant that can be included in a remnant restoration or reconstruction. And it's difficult to mimic the landscape scale processes of fire and herbivory. The more I become involved in prairie reconstruction, the more avid prairie preservationist I become. Prairie remnant restoration projects arrived later in the scene than reconstruction projects. When I joined the ranks of the prairie people in the early 70s, prairie remnants essentially were preserved and left alone. At that time, the concept of climax community still exerted a strong influence on ecological thought regarding community structure and dynamics. Accordingly, it was thought that vegetation within the prairie region would undergo succession and ultimately revert to the climax condition of the native prairie. Therefore, management of the prairie remnant was deemed unnecessary, as it was assumed that the prairie would take care of itself. However, ecological theory regarding the management of prairie remnants had to change, and it did so in the past 4 decades as it became more and more apparent that the remaining remnants were being degraded. The land surrounding the small pieces of prairie remnants have been so drastically alternated that relic populations were genetically isolated and declining in vigor, limited by an absence of external seed sources. Also, these remnants were under constant stress from encroachment by agriculture, invasion by alien species, and damage from the proximal use of herbicide. Therefore, it was obvious that prairie remnants had to be managed to be maintained in the face of the added stress from the increasing alien surroundings. With the decline of cattle production in Iowa and consequent reduction in grazing, the prairie species became more and more evident in old pastures. Typically, these remnants were found in rough terrain with steep hillsides, on the edges of prairie potholes, and on dry, sandy, or rocky areas. Many of these old pastures proved to be good candidates for prairie restoration. A number of prairie restoration projects are in process. The Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, the Iowa TNC, and the Iowa DNR have several large-scale restoration projects underway, such as the aforementioned Waterman Creek project, Broken Kettle Grasslands, and Northeast Iowa Blufflands projects. Most of these areas are comprised of a complex of patches of remnant prairie interspersed through agricultural land. Restoration of the remnant prairie portion involves removing problem species, reintroducing fire, and when necessary, adding seed to supplement species diversity. Prairie then can be reconstructed on former crop fields around the remnants to complete the prairie matrix. In Iowa, prior to 1970, any mention of prairie fire was likely reminiscent of some frightful conflagration of the past century, resulting in extensive property damage or deaths. Even though a few old timers might recall burning pastures, the use of fire in management of prairies was virtually unknown. Eichmann and his students at ISU had conducted some fire research related to prairie in the 1950s, but it was not applied to prairie restoration or management. Jake Landers and Paul Christensen introduced fire as a management tool on the state prairie preserves in the early 1970s. In subsequent years, prescribed burning of prairies increased and gained wide acceptance as a prairie management tool. The Loess Hills Alliance has developed and implemented the Loess Hills Fire Management Plan involving conservation organizations, state and county agencies, and private landowners to manage prairie and savanna in the hills. This consortium provides burn training, equipment, and burn crews. In 1980, I initiated an experimental course at UNI focused on prairies and fire. It was later formalized as fire management of ecosystems, which included training and hands-on experience as a member of prescribed burn crew and wildland firefighter certification. Regional prairie conferences were underway when I joined the rank of prairie enthusiasts. Peter Schramm initiated the first Midwest Prairie Conference at Knox College in 1968. A second followed at the University of Wisconsin 2 years later. I attended the third at Kansas State University in 1972, shortly after KSU and TNC had established the 8,612-acre Kansa Prairie near Manhattan. These conferences on even number of years provide opportunities to share ideas, engage in stimulating conversations, mingle with prairie enthusiasts, conservation personnel, and academics. At the K-State meeting, I can specifically recall my excitement while listening in on an ad hoc, spirited, late evening discussion about prairie reconstruction by Paul Christensen, Peter Schramm, and Ray Schulenberg. These were the folks at the cutting edge of this endeavor, and I, the new kid on the block, was delighted to hear the latest information from the experts. Iowa State hosted the fifth Midwest Prairie Conference in 1976. That was the last one before it was named the North American Prairie Conference. Iowa has hosted more of these prairie conferences than any other state. The 12th at UNI, the 17th at Northern Iowa Area Community College, and the 22nd at UNI. The 26th conference in 2020 was scheduled for Des Moines, but was canceled due to COVID. They are tentatively scheduled to be the host city for the 27th conference in 2024. The Iowa Prairie Conference, on odd-numbered years, complements the NAPC. Pauline Drobny played a major role in initiating the first Iowa Prairie Conference at UNI in 1987. UNI hosted these biennial conferences through 2001, except for 1995 at Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge in Prairie City. In 2002, we began moving the conference to different locations around the state. Today, you're participating in the 18th conference. There's been an increasing application of prairie reconstruction concepts and techniques to solving environmental problems. Two Iowa-based programs stand out: Integrated Roadside Vegetation Management, IRVM, and two science-based trials of row crop integrated with prairie strips called STRIPS. In the mid-80s, the rising costs of fuel, equipment, and maintenance associated with mowing roadsides, along with environmentalists' concern of blanket spraying with herbicides, led to an evaluation of roadside vegetation management practices. Black Hawk County and Story County led grassroots efforts of 6 Iowa counties in initiating roadside management programs utilizing roadside prairie plantings coupled with reduced mowing, and spot spraying of herbicides. Prompted by the acceptance and success of these programs, the 1988 Iowa legislature established an integrated roadside vegetation management program to provide for this cost-effective prairie center, ecologically sound means of managing vegetation and controlling weeds on state and county roadside. According to the legislation, also accompanying the legislation was an establishment of the Living Roadway Trust Fund to assist the counties, states, and cities in utilizing IRVM. The legislation included funding for a roadside program at the University of Northern Iowa to assist counties in implementing and maintaining IRVM programs. Subsequently, numerous Iowa counties adopted IRVM programs. Although several other states had some type of roadside vegetation management program, Iowa moved rapidly to the forefront, achieving national leadership and maintaining that position. This achievement was the result of a timely, creative IRVM legislation, the LRTF fund, the UNI roadside office, and strong county programs. Key players in the successful development of this were Kirk Henderson, Steve Holland, and Mark Matsteller, and the county roadside managers. We should be proud that 32 years later, Iowa still holds the leadership in roadside vegetation management. Prairie strips are a new conservation technology designed to alleviate biodiversity loss and environmental damage associated with row crop agriculture. Strips is a creative win-win practice that could revolutionize row crop farming. Lisa Schutte Moore and colleagues at Iowa State University developed, tested, and implemented strips. In 2007, the Strips project began testing the effects of integrating varying amounts and locations of reconstructed prairie within the watersheds of crop fields. Results from this multi-year catchment scale experiment comparing corn and soybean fields with and without prairie vegetation indicated prairie strips raised pollinator and bird abundance, decreased water runoff, and increased soil and nutrient retention. It was concluded that interlacing parts of prairie into key agricultural fields at a rate of 10% can benefit habitats, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, save soil, and improve water quality. The 2018 Farm Bill named prairie strips as a conservation practice eligible to participate in the Conservation Reserve Program. As of December 30th, 2020, there were 9,251 acres of prairie strips in 13 states. It is estimated that prairie strips could be used to improve biodiversity and ecosystem services across 9.6 million acres of cropland in Iowa, and a large portion of the 170 million acres under similar management in the US. In addition to the two aforementioned programs, there's been a considerable increase in prairie plantings in the USDA CRP. Initially in the 1980s, it was difficult to get approval for prairie plantings on CRP. However, the rules were modified to include establishment of a prairie mixture of CP25. As one traverses the state these days, these CRP plantings are quite apparent. This provides another opportunity to counter the declining habitat and agricultural landscape. The production of seed for prairie plantings has changed dramatically in the past half century. When I first became involved in prairie reconstruction, seed quantities were limited and seed was expensive. Native seed producers were small hobby type operators that sold seed hand collected from native prairie remnants or small production plots of previously hand collections. The only seed available in large quantities were cultivars of native grass species selectively developed for rangeland restoration by the Plant Materials Center at Manhattan, Kansas. Many prairie reconstructionists objected to the use of native cultivars, fearing they would overwhelm local populations. They were of the opinion that seed sources for reconstruction should be near the planting site, less than 5 to 10 miles. Native seed production became more of a business operation with the demand for seed for increased pre-production. Some producers, like Carl Kurtz, machine harvest from Remnant, plant the harvested material, supplementing it with hand collection to create production fields. When the production fields mature, seed is bulk harvested, partially cleaned, tested for prairie species, and sold as a prairie mixture for reconstruction. Other growers maintain separate plots for each species, harvest individual species separately, clean the seed, and plant individual species production plots. When the species production plots mature, the seed is harvested, cleaned, tested for germination, and sold as pure live seed to utilize in seed mixtures for reconstruction. Both types of seed production have contributed to very successful reconstructions. The development of IRVM based on prairie plantings created a need for more native seed. In spite of the concern revolving cultivars, they continue to be used due to budget concerns. To maintain the integrity of the Iowa program, many opine that only Iowa native seed should be used for roadside prairie plantings. Large quantities of economically competitive Iowa origin seed were needed to provide an alternative to cultivars. This prompted development of the Iowa Ecotype project by the Native Roadside Vegetation Center at UNI, later called the Tallgrass Prairie Center. The Ecotype project, initiated in 1990, divided the state into 3 zones north to south, excluding the Loess Hills. Seeds of individual species were collected from sites within each zone and grown collectively in separate zone production plots. When sufficient seed of species available, it was released to commercial growers to increase for marketing. From 1990 to 2016, the project made over 3,000 original collections of seed and released nearly 400 lots of seed of 60 plus species to 17 growers for commercial production. More than 1.25 million pounds of seed was produced from these releases over a 20-year period from 1996 to 2016. The plant materials program, the Tallgrass Center at UNI, currently continues to provide source identified seed for growers to increase and market. In 1998, Kirk Henderson, UNI roadside program manager, brought economic incentive and stability to the Iowa native seed market with the first of 23 annual federal transportation enhancements grants from the Federal Highway Administration. These grants annually provided funds to purchase as Iowa origin seed for 50 or more counties with active IRVM programs. Priority was given to purchasing Iowa origin seed over seed of non-specified origin. Demand further increased as the Iowa DOT began to purchase Iowa origin seed for seeding new highway construction projects and plantings on existing highway. In addition, prairie reconstruction at Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge added to the market as they designated 25 southern Iowa counties as the regional source of seed for planting on their refuge. More attention is being devoted to prairie-related activities in academic settings. Grinnell College and Briarcliff University established centers for prairie studies in 1999 and 2009, respectively, to stimulate a broad understanding of the nature and culture of prairie in our region. Tom Rosberg at Drake has managed an externally funded prairie rescue program with students since 2003 to aid in the restoration and management of prairie remnants. The University of Northern Iowa Tallgrass Prairie Vegetation Center was established in 1999 and later renamed the Tallgrass Prairie Center in 2006. The TPC develops research techniques, education, and source identified seed for restoration and preservation of prairie vegetation and rights-of-way in other lands. It also serves as a state and Midwest regional center to promote, educate, and provide technical support in advancing the utilization of prairie plants and management of rights-of-way and conservation practices on ag land, promoting a native seed supply for restorations that is diverse, regionally appropriated, source identified, and affordable, and conducting applied research in prairie restoration. The center provides materials and opportunities in prairie education and leadership in prairie restoration, reconstruction, and management. Well, I've just spent a lot of time recounting many noteworthy activities involving prairie preservation, restoration, and utilization and related activities. Considering what we began with 50 years ago, we've done well. Protecting more than 27,000 acres of native prairie in the past century should be a source of great appreciation and pride. We have certainly staunched the flow of prairie losses. Restoration and management will continue to be needed, but this is an impressive accomplishment. The best hope for retaining this historic tallgrass prairie ecosystem is to continue to protect remnants, restore degraded remnants, reconstruct new patches to approximate the prairie settlement, pre-settlement prairie, and utilize prairie and conservation efforts. Restorations and reconstructions should include as wide array as possible of all types of prairie organisms. I have suggested in other venues that the 21st century may become known as the restoration century. Prairie restoration could be a major contributor to mending the rents in the fabric of our natural system and perhaps contribute to global natural resource conservation. In spite of the many challenges associated with restoring this historic ecosystem, the ecological, economic, educational, and cultural rewards are well worth the effort. We simply can't lose a national treasure. And don't forget the affective aspect of prairie. As my friend Arnold Webster commented to me one morning while walking off the Cedar Hills Sand Prairie, after spending an hour or so on the prairie, I can begin to feel the cussedness run out of me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daryl. Gosh, we really, really appreciate that. And I feel like I've been around Prairie for a little while now, but it's really great to just kind of come full circle with that whole historical aspect and all of Iowa's milestones. We do have some questions in the chat. So you mentioned changes. Is it okay if I start asking questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. I don't want to interrupt.
Let me get a sip of
Yeah.
go.
All right. So you mentioned changes related to increasing mowing frequency and lowering mowing height when it comes to reconstructions
Yes.
and/or restoration. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, when we first started establishing prairie back in the 70s, it was kind of generally recommended that you let the prairie grow until maybe late August or early September, when it got maybe 15 or 16 inches high, and then mow it. And that was kind of the general advice at that particular point in time. Carl Kurtz and some others started with taking a look at that and decided that since these prairie plants were so small and needed a lot more sunlight, that mowing shorter and more frequently might be a good idea, and tried that technique out. And that's been proven to be very successful. So that's what I'm referring to. From those early days of 15 and 16 inches tall, once at most twice a summer, to maybe 4 to 6 inches high and maybe 3 or 4 times in the summer, depending on the amount of weeds.
And do you mean leaving the vegetation at 4 to 6 inches high, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So would you recommend cutting it at roughly 8, 10 inches versus the 14 to 16 inches, or does that cutting height stay the same? It's just a matter of cutting.
Yeah, the cutting height stays pretty much the same. Yeah, if you got it up 6 to 8 inches, I think you're above those tiny prairie plants, and you're not likely to damage them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do you know how much remnant prairie exists in other states like Nebraska, Illinois, Minnesota, etc.?
I have a chart. Minnesota's got a bit more than we do. I think they're up around maybe 1% or thereabouts. Illinois has got less than us. They're about maybe 0.05%. I can't recall Missouri, but of course Nebraska and South Dakota and Kansas, they run higher because the midgrass prairie has been less damaged, and the Flint Hills tallgrass prairie has remained pretty much intact.
Great, thank you.
If you're interested, send me a note and I can send you there. I got a chart that lists all the percentages remaining in the different states.
Yeah, if you could send that to me, I can send it to everybody after the meeting is over.
Yeah, I don't have it right at my fingertips, but I can dig it out. Yeah.
Sure. So the question of the day, how do you keep your emotional, mental energy up How do you keep on keeping on?
Well, I don't know. Way back in the early 70s, I was ambitious enough and thought maybe I could save the whole world by myself. But I felt that I finally decided I would probably better limit it to maybe prairie and stuff. But I feel very strongly that more people should be informed of prairie. And I guess just talking about prairie and thinking of prairie provides motivation for me. And unlike some of the early speakers, I don't think I'm an introvert. I think I'm probably an extrovert. So you could probably wake me up at 2 a.m. in the morning and I'd be willing to talk prairies with you about it. I do other things. I read a lot. I'm kind of do a little bit of photography, not as much as I'd like, but I'm just motivated. I guess I'm on a mission, if nothing else, to talk about prairie and tell people about prairie.
Well, we are forever grateful for that. That is for sure.
Let
And,
me also say about this paper. Like I said, when I took this on, I bit off more than I can chew. I probably left out some important things. So if you want to send me anyone wants to send me their request, Daryl, DARYL.smith@uni.edu, I'll send you a copy of the whole paper and you can edit it if you want and add in some stuff to it that I've forgotten if you would like. I'd appreciate that because I think it's important that we have some historical record of what's been going on. And it was kind of fun to pull this all together from that standpoint.
absolutely. Yeah, I was chatting with Michelle during your talk and basically saying, wow, this is a really great historical archive that we get to record and have forever. So, well, unless there's any other questions that pop in the next few seconds, I think
I
that's
apologize, by the way, for losing power on my computer, Godfrey's.
Hey, oh, we do have another question. Can you tell us more about the Cedar Hill Sand Prairie?
How long do you have? Well, the Cedar Hill Sand Prairie was, as I said, rediscovered by a graduate student named Glenn Crum in the early 70s. It was known before, other people had visited before. Martin Grant, who was an early faculty member, I found later had been aware of it. And then I also found that there was a professor from one of the Dubuque schools who had grown up about 2 miles north of there. And so he was well aware of it. But it's a 37-acre sand prairie. The sand is about anywhere from 19 to 25 feet deep. And it's kind of on a high area between the West Fork of the Little Cedar River and the Beaver Creek. And apparently during the retreat of the Wisconsin glaciation in the winter, the wind-blown sand that came off of the flats that were frozen flats and blew up and sort of drifted and formed into this prairie cap on this hilltop, and it's quite extensive. The Cedar River is only a couple of miles to the east, but studies of this sand particles show that the sand really came from the West Fork of the Cedar, which is about, 3 or 4 or 5 miles to the northwest of the prairie. I think they're like, I can't remember the exact number, but Ed Freeze has done a thorough botanical survey on it, and I think there's 400 and some species in it. There's been an additional approximately 60 acres added to the original 37. That portion was partially farmed up until 1967, but it's recovering rapidly, and there's being seed transported from the original 30 acre remnant into the north part. And then we've had student projects and volunteer organization projects where we've collected seed in the southern remnant portion and carried them up and distributed in the northern portion. So that portion is recovering too. But it's kind of a neat prairie. Yeah. And I think it probably survived because the soil was too poor to farm. It was grazed periodically, but not enough to wipe out the prairie vegetation.
Wonderful. Thank you. I've been to that prairie once and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's got problems. It's got woody invasion like all the others, and we're fighting it. But it's a tough process.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Daryl, for taking the time today. We really, really appreciate it.
I enjoy doing it.
All right. So luckily for us on a Saturday, we are ahead of schedule. So we can wrap this up a few minutes early, but I just want to, Michelle is actually going to do the official closing comments. But I just want to take a moment to thank you all who joined us today. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you learned something. I hope you connected with people, virtually as best as we can, and, get out there, and hopefully we'll be able to hit up a field trip tomorrow, or see a prairie somewhere near you in the future. So Michelle, go ahead and do the official closing.
All right, Sarah, thank you for being the voice of the Iowa Prairie Conference. I know there has been, we have a thank you in our slideshow, but this has been not a long time coming, but a little bit of a long time coming, and a lot of different people all made this happen. So it's not just a one and done thing. It takes a lot of people working together. And I know that it is pretty late, and this has been a long time to sit in front of your computer. So I thank you for everyone who's held in with us and who has attended. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. I do want to keep my comments short because I could go on and on, but we have been stuck in front of a computer for too long. So I'm sure everybody's itching to get away. Just to let you know, if you do want to attend any of our other events that we have, follow us on iowaprairienetwork.org, or we have a Facebook page. We also have Twitter, and we have Instagram. So all of those different ways to connect with us. But so as we've been going on and the speakers have been talking, I was asking the same question over and over, like, what do you do as a person who cares about the world, who cares about others, who cares about our environment? How do you stay emotionally positive? Keep your mental energies, mental capacity from getting too low. I'll share with you all. I have been dealing with some of those mental issues as well. I have anxiety, I have depression, all of those things I am dealing with now with therapy, and I have been prescribed medications. I know that in our society, in our American society, I don't want to say mental illness, but mental issues are kind of taboo. People don't like to talk about them, but literally anyone with a brain deals with these kinds of things. Everybody gets down, everybody gets stressed. It's very easy to feel overwhelmed and overburdened by all of the negativity that is happening in the whole world, let alone what's in front of you. So just to let you know that you are not the only one who feels this way. You're not the only one who gets overburdened, who feels overwhelmed, who gets depressed about, our world falling apart in front of us and feeling like there's nothing you can do to change it. A lot of people feel that way, and it's okay to ask for help. And it's important that you keep yourself healthy, because you cannot kick butt and fight the good fight if you are an emotional mess on the floor. So it's really important for you to be a strong leader and a strong advocate for the natural world, that you take care of yourself. And here are some of the ways that our speakers suggested that they take care of themselves. By connecting with their community, with ceremonies that are important to you, and having faith in your ancestors. By keeping or giving yourself time. By taking some time to be by yourself, doing something that you actually find fun, that's not related to work, that's not related to conservation, just something that you enjoy. It doesn't have to be work all the time. Keep a respectful boundary between your conservation work and your home life. You try your best. It's nothing, none of these things are an easy fix or a button that you push on and off. They're all things you'll have to work towards probably forever. But trying to keep that distance between your home life and your work. Pausing to take time. Disconnecting. I'm going to assume, for me anyways, I would be disconnecting with social media and disconnecting with the news, and just kind of giving yourself a break. That's really important. Being with your family, embracing your faith, whatever that looks like. Finding what grounds you personally and what roots you. And it's okay to grieve. In our session that we had in our breakout room, someone mentioned that grieving is important. I think it was Kahi, sorry. That we have lost a lot, and we are part of the solution and we're a part of the problems as human beings. And we have lost a lot. We've lost friends and family. We've lost biodiversity. We've lost a healthy habitat. We've lost healthy, clean water. And it's okay to grieve that. We have lost those things. They're real and they've been taken from us in so many different ways. So it is okay to feel sadness for those things, to work through the grieving process. And to let you know that you're not alone in these feelings. You're not alone in caring, and you're not alone in suffering. And it is important to know that other people feel these ways too. You're not a monster. You're not a freak. You're not a weirdo. You're an empathetic human being, and I'm glad that you care, because it makes me feel good to know that there's this many people that are interested and that do care. So take on or try to contribute in ways that are good for you. This was a good one. I really liked this one. It's okay to be selfish. No, I don't think anyone here at this conference is selfish in the way where they would, not care about the world, not care about society, not care about, other species, because, you're here. So it makes me think you're probably interested in those things. So it's okay for you to be selfish. You have to take care of yourself first. And if you're doing projects, or you're doing jobs or work, or you're taking on a lot of volunteer work, and you're finding that it's not really good for you, maybe it's too much, and it's okay for it to be too much, or maybe it's not a good fit for you. It's important that you recognize those things and you help find someone else to do those jobs. If it is only taking away from you and it's not adding to you as a person, it's probably not a good thing. Even if it is, quote unquote, saving the world, maybe you need to do it in a different way so that you can also continue on in the long term, help save the world. Not just, don't be the flame that burns out in a minute. You need to be the flame that burns on and on for days and months. The flame that re-energizes the prairie, the flame that eats up all the old dead fuel that's smothering the baby prairie seeds that can't germinate without that fire. So you need to be able to, tend to your own flame. Otherwise, you're not going to get to go very far. And I've learned that myself. So I'm trying to tend to my flame so that I can do my best as long as I can. But thank you everyone again for coming and spending time with us and making yourselves vulnerable and reaching out to other species and other people, other humans. Thank you for caring. So I just really appreciate everyone being here, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Those of you that we're going to see on the prairie on our field trips tomorrow, I hope you enjoy every single second of it. Don't forget to look closer in the prairie, because there's a lot of things that we don't see from a distance. So thank you. That's my official sign off.